mistake of acknowledging my counterpart, Congressman Walker, during a hearing that I didn't realize was actually on the record. So I'm going to repeat what I said previously, because our friend who is injured because he tried to wrestle me, he has made the decision to briefly pause his career in public service. I don't believe it is the last chapter by any sense of the word, but to say so definitively on the record, it has been one of the greatest honors of my life serving on this subcommittee with Mr. Walker, and I look forward to serving with you in many different capacities for many years to come, sir. So, this subcommittee is meeting today to receive testimony on confronting the rise in anti-Semitic domestic terrorism. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the subcommittee in recess at any point. Without objection, members not on the committee shall be permitted to sit and question the witnesses. I now recognize myself for an opening statement, and I will make it quick because I'm very eager to hear the testimony of the experts before us. Poway, Pittsburgh, Muncie, 1,800 anti-Semitic incidents in 2018 throughout the United States. 2,049 of these incidents carried out by extremists. Since December 23rd, over a dozen attacks on Jews across New York City. And after each and every one of these attacks, there is some elected official in America that says our thoughts and prayers are with the victim and their families. After each and every one of these attacks, there is some elected official in America who says we must take action. Well, today, that is exactly what we have got to focus on. The why. Why is this happening? How is this happening? But most importantly, what do we do tomorrow and the next week and the next month? Today, in my community and communities across America, Jews are afraid to go outside with their kippah on, afraid to speak Hebrew in public, afraid to congregate amongst their friends and family, afraid to observe the high holy days. Over 100 years ago, my great-grandfather came to New York City fleeing anti-Semitism. And he came to New York City and he came to America because this country is not just a country, it stands for something. It's been a beacon that if you're fleeing hate, it's been a beacon for freedom. And today we consider how can we ensure that our best days are not in our rearview mirror. We look forward to considering everything from appointing federal officials, FBI, DHS task force. How do we regulate social media? How do we increase funding to make sure that no person is afraid to pray, whether at a church, a synagogue, a mosque? Today, we consider the rise of anti-Semitism across the political spectrum because we realize this is not a problem for any political party. And this is not certainly something that we should subject to the hyper-partisanship and divisiveness that has taken over this town. Hopefully, for a few hours today, we can be a body that considers a problem and solutions to that problem. So, with that, ladies and gentlemen, again, thank you all for being here. I would like to acknowledge Chairman Thompson, who is, I think, the most extraordinary chairman of a committee in the history of the United States Congress. And I defer to you if you would like to make an opening statement, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm not usually getting such nice comments from you, but I thank you for convening this important hearing today. This hearing is an opportunity for all members of Congress to come together and condemn acts of domestic terrorism and targeted violence motivated by anti-Semitism. The issue has been a priority for a long time for this committee. As many of you heard at our May 2019 full committee hearing entitled Confronting the Rise of Domestic Terrorism in the Homeland, we've seen a dramatic and disturbing rise in acts of right-wing domestic terrorism, including anti-Semitic violence in recent years. Unfortunately, recent events have once again confirmed that anti-Semitic violence is an urgent and growing threat to the homeland. Just last month, the Jewish communities in New York and New Jersey area were subject to multiple violent, hateful acts. These acts have once again reminded us why it is so important for the federal government to work with its state and local partners to combat anti-Semitic domestic terrorism. Across the country, we've seen that houses of worship and other religious institutions have increasingly been targeted for acts of violence. That is why I was proud to introduce H.R. 2476, the American Nonprofit Organizations Against Terrorism Act of 2019, which authorizes the Nonprofit Security Grant Program for years to come. The program provides grants to nonprofits and faith-based organizations in both urban and rural areas to help secure their families against a potential terrorist attack. I'm pleased the bill passed both the House and Senate, and I hope that the President will sign it into law shortly. While this is an important step, Congress must make sure that all precautions are taken to protect communities targeted by hate and violence. This includes reevaluating the grants program funding levels and working with community groups and leaders to establish meaningful partnership to tackle this issue. Separately, I'm encouraged that DHS released the first ever strategic framework for combating terrorism and targeted violence. Although I still have many questions as to its implementation, this strategy appears to be a step in the right direction. I look forward to continuing oversight over the department on this issue and working together with stakeholders to suggest further improvements in this effort. I hope to hear today additional suggestions as to how this committee can curb domestic terrorism while respecting and protecting the civil rights and civil liberties of all Americans. Congress must continue to advocate for policies that protect the Jewish community and all communities impacted by acts of domestic terror. I look forward to hearing testimony from the witness, and I again thank Chairman Rose for convening this hearing. I yield back.
Thank you, sir. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson and Chairman Rose. I appreciate your genuine passion on this topic. I want to thank you for scheduling this important hearing and for last week's subcommittee roundtable with nonprofit groups, which provide important background information for today's hearing. We could deny what we're seeing take place, but there's no question that the rise in anti-Semitic behavior has increased. Freedom of religion means freedom of belief and the freedom of expression of those beliefs. This cornerstone constitutional freedom is violated when people cannot gather safely in places of worship, community centers, or even their own house. It is also violated if they are threatened at work, on a college campus, or during community activities. In the past 14 months, since a white supremacist committed the most lethal attack targeting Jews in the United States at the Tree of Life Synagogue, there have been multiple deadly anti-Semitic attacks in the U.S., including San Diego, Jersey City, Rockland County, New York. In fact, no community is immune to the threat of anti-Semitism, and that unfortunately includes areas I represent. Last year, weeks before Rosh Hashanah, anti-Semitic propaganda was found at Temple Emmanuel in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and later, a car was damaged by gunfire outside the Chabad Jewish Student Center at Elon University as services marking the end of Yom Kippur were taking place. Unfortunately, anti-Semitic attacks in the U.S. have been rising, and the trends are similar across Europe. I can remember after the shooting in Pennsylvania on that Saturday morning, I found myself at Temple Emmanuel in Greensboro, just wanting to reach out to my friends there, and couldn't have been more welcomed by Rabbi Fred Gutman and Rabbi Andy Coren. Anti-Semitic incidents in the United States demonstrate a variety of ideological motivations. The attacker at the Tree of Life Synagogue was motivated by white nationalist beliefs. The Jersey City attackers were connected to the Black Hebrew Israelite movement, and no clear ideological motivation has been identified for several of the attacks and slurs against Jews in New York City during this past month of December. An attack on any faith is an attack on the faithful. Violent attacks and hate crimes must explicitly and soundly be condemned. There is no one solution to combat faith-based attacks, but there is more that can be done by the government, the private sector, and the faith-based community. We have a very distinguished panel of witnesses here today who will offer a number of recommendations, including additional nonprofit security grant funding, a greater role for fusion centers, more information sharing, and an end to the anti-Semitic boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS movement. I look forward to hearing more about these and other recommendations from all of the witnesses. Finally, the broad range of ideologically based hatred in our society's continued obsession with violence has left too many scars across our country. I remain fully committed to an open, bipartisan discussion about domestic terrorism, hateful ideologies, and meaningful recommendations for addressing these threats to our homeland. We must continue to work in a bipartisan fashion to help solve the complex problems associated with not only anti-Semitism, but the proliferation of hate and intolerance. I want to thank the witnesses, along with the chairman, for appearing here today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, sir. I welcome our panel of witnesses. Our first witness is Mr. Jonathan Greenblatt, the CEO of ADL, the Anti-Defamation League. Thank you for being here. Next, we are joined by Mr. Nathan Diamond, Executive Director of the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations of America. And if I could just say one thing, we have seen certainly the Orthodox community disproportionately suffering from a high rate of these anti-Semitic attacks. I have the luxury of stepping outside my home and people not necessarily knowing I'm Jewish. Our brothers and sisters in the Orthodox community do not have that luxury. And today we do acknowledge this problem, and we do thank you for your leadership, sir. Next, we're joined by Mr. Eugene Kontorovich, and I apologize for what I'm doing to all of your names, a professor of law at the Scalia Law School at George Mason University. Finally, we have Mr. Clifford D. May, founder and president of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be inserted in the record. I now ask each witness to summarize his statement for 5 minutes, beginning with Mr. Greenblatt.
Chairman Rose, Ranking Member Walker, Chairman Thompson, and all the distinguished members of the subcommittee, on behalf of ADL, thank you for the opportunity to testify today and share our perspective. For more than a century, ADL has been battling anti-Semitism and fighting to secure justice and fair treatment to all. We stand on the front lines of fighting hate in any form. And it's fair to say that the past few years have been the most challenging that we've seen in recent memory. You've already mentioned some of the spots, from Pittsburgh to Poway, from Muncie to Jersey City, from El Paso to Orlando, from Charleston to Christchurch, and the list goes on. But it's not just the high-profile, violent attacks and lethal incidents that I want to talk about today. It's the kid who snaps a Heil Hitler salute for a gag. It's the swastikas scrawled on a garage door. The college campuses where Jewish students are ostracized for supporting Israel. This moment is about women wearing wigs harassed as they ride the subway. It's about men in black hats assaulted as they cross the street. It's the idea that a person isn't safe in their supermarket, in their synagogue, or in their home just because they are Jewish. In fact, in ADL's most recent audit of anti-Semitic incidents, we recorded more than 1,800 acts in 2018, the third highest total that we've seen in 40 years. The results came on the heels of our 2017 audit, which documented a 57% surge over the prior year, the largest on record. And in 2019, in New York City alone, there were more anti-Jewish hate crimes than all the other hate crimes put together. Now, what may surprise you is that this increase is happening against a backdrop of steady, relatively low levels of anti-Semitic attitudes among the general population. That is, our fellow Americans aren't hating more, but there is a growing group of people who are acting out on hate. So why is that? First, we have leading voices in our nation, from both sides of the political spectrum, in academic institutions, in the media, in other stations in public life, who are normalizing anti-Semitism. They are using anti-Semitic myths and tropes about globalists controlling government, Jewish money destroying our borders, dual loyalty to Jewish citizens, or attacking the Jewish state with the same dangerous myths that were used throughout history to demonize the Jewish people. And all of this destigmatizes anti-Semitism and renders it routine. That's why it's so important that we call out anti-Semitism whenever it happens, but especially when it's uttered by our own allies and friends. We need leaders to stop politicizing anti-Semitism and weaponizing it for partisan gain, no matter what their political affiliation. We need citizens to step up and demand more of people in public life, that they should insist on a zero-tolerance policy on intolerance, full stop. And on that score, Mr. Chairman, I'll just acknowledge it. You've shown real courage in speaking out, and I applaud you for it. Now, a second reason is that we have online platforms that tolerate anti-Semitism and hate. And I'm not talking about just adults, but children can find horrific hate taking place online with just a click or a swipe, 24/7, 365 days a week. Now, as someone who has managed engineers and built software products in Silicon Valley, I know the culture there, and I know full well that tech can do good. But it's impossible to ignore the fact that it's become an amplifier, a connector, a catalyst for some of the worst types of hate in our society. So it's long overdue for the social media companies to step up and shut down the neo-Nazis on their platforms. Companies like Twitter and Facebook need to apply the same energy to protecting vulnerable users that they apply to protecting their corporate profits. That will take putting more pressure on these companies and perhaps even new regulations. But today, I want to follow up on what the chairman said. This is not the time for thoughts and prayers. We need resources and action. So let me give you some ideas of what you can do right now across party lines. Number one, pass the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act to ensure that law enforcement agencies deal with violent extremists on the home front. Pass the No Hate Act to ensure local law enforcement is trained up on how to deal with this. Pass legislation to hold the perpetrators of online hate accountable, the Online Safety Modernization Act. Fourth, pass the Never Again Holocaust Education Act, so children are educated about the evils of prejudice unbound. Fifth, fully fund the Nonprofit Security Grants Program to shore up at-risk institutions and meet the needs of all faith groups, synagogues, their schools, their community centers, and do that today. And lastly, I want to encourage the State Department to examine whether violent white supremacist organizations overseas, those frequently connecting with and inspiring equally violent hate groups here at home, meet the criteria to be designated foreign terrorist organizations. If these groups are a threat to our homeland, and if Americans are supporting them, we can bring the full force of the law and society against them. ADL stands ready to serve as your partner. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. We now recognize Mr. Diamond to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Rose, Ranking Member Walker, Chairman Thompson, and members of the subcommittee. As was mentioned, my name is Nathan Diamond, and I'm the Executive Director for Public Policy for the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations of America. We're the largest Orthodox Jewish umbrella organization in the United States, representing hundreds of synagogues and Jewish parochial schools around the country. We're a nonpartisan charitable organization. In the year 1790, in his famous letter to the Jewish community of Newport, Rhode Island, George Washington ended his letter with a prayer. It reads, "May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid." I've been asked to testify here before your subcommittee to describe the problem uniquely faced by the Orthodox Jewish segment of the American Jewish community. And that problem is simply this. Now in the year 2020, in the United States of America, the children of Abraham are afraid in a way we have never been before. We are under threat of violence as we walk down a city street or enter our synagogues to pray, or shop in a supermarket for kosher groceries. In the United States, even though there's been discrimination against Jews for many years, as there's been in other places around the world, in the United States it was not predominantly of a violent kind, but now it is. As was mentioned, as you well know, Jews were gunned down at prayer at synagogues in Pittsburgh and Poway, and shopping for groceries in Jersey City. Visibly identifiable Orthodox Jews and Hasidic Jews have been assaulted on the streets of New York, Miami, and elsewhere. And indeed, it's the most visible Jews, those of us who wear a hat or a shtreimel or a kippah, or who may have peyos at the sides of our heads or a long beard, who have been subject most to these verbal and physical assaults. Anxiety about this new reality is present in Orthodox Jewish communities in all your districts and across the entire country. In the American Orthodox Jewish community, there is a widespread belief that this wave of physical attacks are an outgrowth of many years of expressions of not only anti-Semitic bias in general, but anti-Orthodox Jewish bias in particular, that have long gone unreported and unrepudiated. In recent years, in too many localities around the country, government officials and community leaders have felt comfortable making anti-Orthodox statements in particular and undertaking anti-Orthodox actions. In multiple towns in New Jersey, Ocean Township, Jackson, and Mahwah, local leaders sought to use zoning and land use regulations to try to prevent Orthodox Jews from moving into their towns. In the course of doing so, those local officials referred to Orthodox Jews as, quote, invading the community, as, quote, dirty, or as, quote, religious zealots. It took the intervention of the U.S. Department of Justice or the State Attorney General's office to resolve those disputes. In Chester, New York, upstate in the Hudson Valley, the town supervisor and leadership have openly spoken about blocking housing developments to prevent Hasidic Jews from moving in, saying, if there's any way for us to choose who could live there, we will. In Jersey City, days after the shooting, which killed 2 Orthodox Jews as well as a police officer and wounded others, a member of the local Board of Education referred to Jews, quote, as brutes, who, quote, waved bags of money and asked if people in the community at large are brave enough to, quote, explore the message the shooters were trying to send. This person still sits on the Jersey City Board of Education. Finally, in Rockland County, New York, where the Hanukkah celebration attack occurred last month, the Rockland County Republican Party released a video advertisement last summer criticizing an incumbent county official who is an Orthodox Jew and supports housing development that would allow more Orthodox families to move into that area. The video accused the identifiably Orthodox county legislator as, quote, plotting a takeover of the community that, quote, threatens our way of life. The video was eventually taken down after a flood of criticism. These are just a few of many examples and incidents in which Orthodox Jews are portrayed as some kind of other and not part of American society. It's important to realize that these offensive incidents targeted at Orthodox Jewry are amplified and accelerated by the broader surge in anti-Semitism we are experiencing in the United States, which Jonathan and the ADL have well documented. It's in this context, Orthodox Jews being explicitly slandered and Jews generally being subjected to classical anti-Semitic accusations, that visible, recognizable Jews are being targeted for assault and abuse, and suffering this reality in an unprecedented way in this country. Mr. Chairman, I will conclude these opening remarks by saying that even in the face of all of this, I am not without hope. The fact that elected leaders from President Trump to Governor Cuomo to Governor Murphy and many others have not only spoken out against this surge of anti-Semitic and anti-Orthodox attacks, but have started to undertake concrete action to have our federal, state, and local governments respond and begin to make our communities safe gives me hope. The fact that you, Chairman Rose, and your colleagues have convened this hearing to confront this problem and look for more effective ways that we can stop it gives me hope. And the fact that I, as an Orthodox Jew representing my community, was able to join with people of many different faiths to serve on the Department of Homeland Security Advisory Committee chaired by General Allen, who you will hear from in the next panel, and make recommendations for how our federal government can protect not only America's synagogues, but also churches and mosques and temples, this too gives me hope. I'm hopeful that we can all work together to keep President Washington's prayer alive for my community and for all faith communities. And to effectuate that, I think we need to join with it the prayer that was presented in Albany, New York last week by Rabbi Chaim Rotenberg, whose home in Muncie was the site of the attack. He delivered the prayer last week in Albany at the governor's State of the State address. And included in his prayer, Rabbi Rotenberg said, quote, "Merciful God, bless us all with the courage to overcome tragedy, heal the wounds of hatred, and bless us with solidarity to promote tolerance and brotherhood among all our communities." That is a recipe for action, and that is a recipe for success in this fight. We must all join in that prayer and this effort, because if America slides further into the swamp of anti-Semitism, it means our beloved United States is losing an essential element of its founding identity, to be a beacon of religious freedom in the world. I thank you again for holding this hearing today, and I thank you in advance for the actions you will take. As a member of that advisory committee, I obviously join in that list of recommendations, which you'll discuss as this hearing goes on. Thank you for working with us to combat this terrible situation.
Thank you, sir. We now recognize Mr. May to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Chairman Rose, Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Walker, distinguished members of the... Thank you. Chairman Rose, Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Walker, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you, Congressman Slotman. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I commend you for holding this hearing. I'm going to talk about international anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic terrorism, and strongly suggest that these expressions of bigotry and violence are making a significant contribution to the rise in anti-Semitic domestic terrorism. Jew hatred is as old as the Judean hills, predating even the ancient rebellions of the Jewish nation against the Roman imperialists and colonialists who had conquered their lands. Over the centuries, Jews have been persecuted, attacked, and murdered based on their religion and what used to be called their race. They have been despised for being rich and poor, as capitalists and communists, as ruthless cosmopolitans, and in Israel, as nationalists. Jew haters may be white supremacists, Islamic supremacists, or self-proclaimed social justice warriors. You can't reason people out of anti-Semitism because no one was ever reasoned into it. What should be apparent, important point I think, in the 20th century, anti-Semitism culminated in the extermination of the European Jew. In the 21st century, anti-Semitism is meant to culminate in the extermination of the Jewish state. Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, and the Islamic Republic of Iran, which supports those and other terrorist groups, are candid about their genocidal intentions. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has called Israel a, quote, malignant, cancerous tumor that must be removed and eradicated. Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah's leader, has said, if Jews, I'm quoting again, if Jews all gather in Israel, it will save us the trouble of going after them worldwide. It is often forgotten or ignored that more than half of the Jews in Israel descend from families that lived for centuries in Arab or Muslim lands, in such formerly diverse cities as Cairo, Tripoli, Aleppo. Baghdad circa 1945 was as much as 1/3 Jewish. In the aftermath of World War II, Jews were driven out, not because they supported Israel. No, they were driven out because they were Jews. You'll hear people say, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Zionist. Prior to 1948, the Zionist mission was to reestablish a Jewish nation state in part of the ancient Jewish homeland. One could oppose that for any number of reasons. Since 1948, Zionism has come to mean support for Israel's survival, for its right to exist. So if you are an anti-Zionist today, you are at best indifferent to the fate of the only viable Jewish community remaining in the Middle East. In other words, to an anti-Zionist, Jewish lives do not matter. If anti-Semitism is a disease, what we're experiencing today is a global epidemic. Jew hatred has become not just widely acceptable, but edgy, even fashionable in some quarters, in lands even where there are virtually no Jews. One example, Malaysia's Prime Minister, Mahathir Mohamad, is outspokenly anti-Semitic. Last fall at Columbia University, there was a global leaders forum where he was invited to speak, and he instructed his audience, quote, When you say you cannot be anti-Semitic, there is no free speech. He added, why can't I say something about the Jews when people say nasty things about me and about Malaysia? Would Columbia University have honored a global leader, as a global leader, a Christian or a Jew who spoke that way about Muslims, Salvadorans, or members of the LGBT community? In France, Sarah Halimi, a retired physician and director of a nursery, was stabbed and thrown to her death from her balcony by a neighbor screaming Allahu Akbar. A French court has now dismissed all charges against her killer on grounds that he was not responsible because he had been smoking marijuana. In Argentina 5 years ago, Alberto Nisman, a prosecutor investigating the bombing of a Jewish community center, was shot in the head hours before he was to present evidence of a plot involving then-President Christina Kirchner and officials of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The current president says he has no idea who was responsible. Another cover-up of an alleged cover-up? In Great Britain recently, there was a serious chance that an anti-Semite would be elected prime minister. I could go on, but I want to take one moment to remind you that the United Nations is a veritable volcano of anti-Israeli rhetoric and resolutions. The UN Human Rights Council is that organization's most prolific enemy of the Jewish state. American tax dollars support it. Mainstreaming and in some instances condoning Jew hatred, both abroad and at home, may not cause anti-Semitic domestic terrorism, but it is self-evidently a major contributing factor. My time is up. In my written testimony, I elaborate, I offer additional information based on the research of FDD scholars, and provide 14 specific recommendations. My colleagues and I can come up with many more, and we'd be glad to help you along with those. Chairman Rose, Ranking Member Walker, Chairman Thompson, let me again commend you for shedding light on this issue, and again, thank you for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. We now turn to Mr. Kontorovich to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Chairman Rose, Ranking Member Walker, Chairman Thompson, and honorable members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me here today to discuss the unhappy topic of anti-Semitism. My comments will focus on practices and campaigns that legitimize anti-Semitism, that whitewash anti-Semitism, in particular on the anti-Semitic nature of boycotts against people and entities just because of their connection to the State of Israel. Such discriminatory boycotts, known as BDS, do not themselves promote violence, but it does promote inherently anti-Semitic ideas such as the singular evil and pariah status of the Jews. And it is particularly dangerous in that it seeks to make anti-Semitism acceptable in polite society, not just amongst fringe haters. The campaign to boycott Israel seeks to legitimize discriminatory refusals to do business with people or companies because of their connection to the Jewish state. This is bigotry, just as not doing business, boycotting people because of their race, sexual orientation, or national origin is discriminatory. The recognition that the movement known as BDS is anti-Semitic has been widely made around the world by the parliaments of Germany and Canada, by courts in Spain and France, and most significantly, by more than 24 states in America, which have passed laws that treat boycotting, refusing to do business with people because of their connection to Israel, just the way many states and the federal government treat boycotts because of people because of their sexual orientation or other factors as a form of discrimination. It makes no difference that these calls to boycott are aimed at Israel rather than at Jews per se. Israel is the largest Jewish community in the world and the home to the plurality of the world's Jews. Refusals to deal that target Israel alone and no other countries are clear proxies for Jewishness. Anti-discrimination law makes clear that using a proxy for race, sexual orientation, and so forth can be discriminatory. Now, to be sure, supporters of such boycotts say, but there have been good boycotts in the past. What about the boycott of apartheid South Africa in the 1980s? So boycotts are just a tool. How do we know if they're good or bad? 3 factors help identify whether refusals to deal on a group basis are invidious discrimination. The first factor is history. Boycotts of Jewish businesses have a bad history. They've been a staple of anti-Semitic campaigns, most notoriously under Nazi Germany. The boycott of Israel began in 1948 with the creation of the State of Israel by the Arab League to suffocate the new country, long before Israel retook Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, in 1967. The second factor to help differentiate boycotts is focus. The invocation of ostensible international law norms, to demonize and isolate just one country with just 0.1% of the world's population is a sure sign of discrimination. That is why the working definition of anti-Semitism, adopted by the International Holocaust Remembrance Association and many countries now, lists as a contemporary example of anti-Semitism, quote, applying double standards to Israel. Calls for boycotting Israel almost inevitably apply double standards, a unique special standard to the Jewish state. Indeed, as I show today in a Wall Street Journal op-ed published today, it goes far beyond double standards. Some of the most prominent supporters of such boycotts themselves that call for boycotting Israel based on purported international law grounds, enjoy substantial connections to groups active in occupied territories. Settler groups, not just ignoring, but actively contradicting the principles they advance in justifying a Jew-focused boycott. In my article today, I explain that one of the most energetic campaigners for boycotting companies in Israel is the director of the Middle East Division of Human Rights Watch, who herself actively fundraises for groups that support Armenian settlements in occupied Azerbaijani territories. Calls for boycotting Israeli businesses are not about international law. They're about creating a unique aura of illegitimacy around the Jewish state. Finally, the third factor in identifying discriminatory boycotts is the people behind it. Pro-boycott groups have numerous documented links to terror organizations, mentioned in my written testimony. The founders and leaders of the boycott movement have openly called for an end to the Jewish state. History, singularity, people involved, when all these three factors lined up, the anti-Semitic nature of this movement becomes clear, and it is a way of wrapping in the mantle of human rights rhetoric some of the most toxic ideas in history. Congress has a clear role to play in combating this. The Combating BDS Act, which would give Congress's support to the action of now close to 28 states to treat these boycotts as a form of discrimination, and the Anti-Israel Boycott Act, which would add to existing federal regulation against boycotts promoted by foreign countries, the Arab League boycott, boycotts promoted by international organizations, are all important measures deserving of your attention. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Walker, Chairman Thompson, thank you, members of the committee, thank you for your time, and I welcome your questions.
I thank all the witnesses for their testimony. I will remind the subcommittee that we will each have 5 minutes to question the panel. I will now recognize Chairman Thompson from the great state of Mississippi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me, at the outset, thank the witnesses for their testimony. I don't think any member of this panel understands the severity of anti-Semitism and its impact in this country, and want to come to some solutions. But the notion somehow in the minds of some people we engage is there's a quick fix. And so what we're tasked with is to be thoughtful, pragmatic, and to the extent possible, get it right. And so part of your testimony here today moves us in that direction. So one of the comments, and I'm going to ask Mr. Diamond to address it, is that how can we, the government, effectively protect communities against violence in a way that doesn't result in over-policing, profiling, targeting, other strategies that may harm civil rights, civil liberties, and privacy?
Thank you for your question, sir. I would say that at least in my community and our communities around the country, right now the worry is not about over-policing, it's about under-policing. Because incidents are happening, there's violence on the streets, and we need the police to be in the community protecting people from these assaults. The number one thing that I've heard, even though we were among the coalition groups, the leaders of the coalition more than a decade ago that helped create the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, and we thank you for your leadership in moving the authorizing bill to fund that program for the coming years. We did not anticipate back in 2005 when that program started the nightmarish situation that we are in today. And the number one thing that I've heard, certainly from my synagogues and also as part of working with representatives of other faith communities on this issue, is the number one request that synagogues are asking, and I believe churches and mosques and others as well, are we need security guards, or we need the police to be more frequently patrolling outside our houses of worship, even stationed outside our house of worship on a Saturday morning or a Sunday morning or a Friday afternoon. And many police departments don't have the resources to deploy officers to that many locations. So one thing that I would put to you that Congress could do is that the Department of Justice provides many millions of dollars of support on an annual basis to local police departments for various purposes. And I would suggest that Congress should take a look at having some of those DOJ grants that go to local police departments specifically allocated for the purpose of supporting local police efforts to do more policing around houses of worship and in faith communities. I would also say that increasing the resources under the Nonprofit Security Grant Program to help houses of worship either hire security guards or make other protective measures. It's great that we got it up to $90 million this year, but I can tell you that based on the information that the DHS has shared with our advisory committee, last fiscal year when there was $60 million in that pot, there was $169 million worth of applications. In the 5 fiscal years prior to that, there was $131 million in grant money available. There was $357 million worth of applications. So the demand and the need is far out exceeding the resources that Congress is putting into place.
Yeah, and if it were a perfect world and there was no competing interests for the money, it's not a problem. But we have state and locals who communities will say, well, there are other places we need to look at. So, Mr. Greenblatt, can you shed some light on,
Sure.
on this for me?
Sir, there are a few things to think about. First of all, Mr. Chairman, I would just keep in mind that what you said is absolutely true, that when we talk about more policing, that sort of raises some concerns among communities of color because of the long history of systemic racism. Keep in mind, number one, that there are many Jews of color, African American, Caribbean American, Latino, Asian American, Mizrahi, who have similar concerns. So it's not something that is unique to or separate from the Jewish experience. That's number one. Number two, keep in mind that many of the synagogues, the house of worship we're talking about, Pittsburgh, Poway, many others that we see are not located in dense urban environments where there is, bumping up against communities of color. Some of the communities that my colleague mentioned in Rockland County, New York, or in other parts of the area, we just don't have those issues. But number three, as we engage law enforcement to support these communities in this fashion, it clearly needs to be done in a way that is very sensitive to the outlying communities. So what I would suggest is that there is an ability to engage in security measures that keep the synagogues and schools and community centers safe, that keep the mosque and gurdwaras and black churches safe, and do it in a way which is respectful of the equities and civil rights of all the people in the area.
Thank you. I think the question is you have to have the training of the individuals to understand the broader communities
Yes.
that they're working in. So training goes hand in hand. The other issue, Mr. Chairman, if you bear with me, the online platforms that are more or less pushing out a lot of this hate.
Yeah.
We've grappled with it from the committee's perspective as to what do we do. Facebook, for instance, has taken the policy position that if you pay for it, whether it's right or wrong, we're going to let you put it on our platform. Some of us disagree with that. Other platforms have said no. If it's wrong and we know it's wrong, we're not going to put it.
Right.
So we have some public policy issues looking at online hate in those platforms. And I'd like to just get from the four of you how you think Congress should address those online platforms.
Well, if I might, I can give you some specifics and then open it up to my colleagues. I mean, the ADL opened up a center in Silicon Valley in 2017. Our Center for Technology and Society, which is headed up by a former software engineer, is focused very specifically on this problem because we need to work with the companies. The pace of innovation is so dramatic that it is indeed hard to keep up with it, and yet we can't wait for the companies to regulate themselves. So there are steps that can be taken, and I'll just offer you a few considerations. So number one, the Online Safety Modernization Act is really quite relevant. So this is about protecting individuals from harassment and hate online. So that's something you should look at, and that's right now going through committee. I think number two, we should push the companies to take a couple very concrete measures, enforce their own terms of service. All the companies have them. But think about the principle of accountability. They need to enforce their own terms of service the same way other businesses do. If you stand at the Obon Pond downstairs and you yell at all the people, say Mexicans go back to Mexico, they will throw you out. And if you stand at the Starbucks down the street and you yell at the Jews, you guys are destroying our borders, the manager at Starbucks will throw you out. We should ask that Facebook and Twitter exercise the same discretion and throw out the anti-Semites and racists and neo-Nazis. They could do that tomorrow. Second thing I'll just point out is decency. They can de-amplify the anti-Semitism. You can do things to the algorithms to make sure that when you promote, I don't know, neo-Nazi and white supremacist and hateful rhetoric targeting any community from any side of the aisle, that it doesn't pop to the top when your child opens up YouTube. Number three, they should use innovation. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, they should invest the same energy to protecting their users that they do, again, to protecting corporate copyrights. And then lastly, transparency. And this would get to a concern that I know many of us have, because people ask, are they shadow banning certain groups? Are they weighting one idea over the other? Independent, third-party, regular audits. By the way, like all other businesses comply with. This is the thing, and then I'll stop. New media, for some reason, doesn't have to obey the same laws of gravity as old media. Print, broadcast, radio, I could go on. That's because of the Communications Decency Act in Section 230. And whether or not you can take that on, I don't know. But there are steps you can do right now to hold them accountable, and you should.
Mr. Diamond.
I would just briefly, I certainly agree with everything that Jonathan mentioned. I would just add two other points. One is that specifically in the artificial intelligence arena, it's my understanding that software and algorithms have been developed by those who want to thwart sex trafficking. And AI programs have been developed that can be overlaid on the internet and on Facebook and these other platforms, and is able to flag and take down based on keywords, et cetera, and really suppress the ability of sex traffickers to use platforms for that purposes. There's no reason why that AI technology can't also be utilized in combating anti-Semitism and racism and the other kinds of pernicious things that we're trying to oppose. I'll just stop with that.
Thank you. Mr. May?
I would certainly associate myself with the remarks of my two colleagues here. I think they know a lot about social media and have studied it certainly more than we have. I would just add that anti-Semitism is an ancient hatred. I do not think we are going to cure it. I think we can treat it in many ways. You mentioned training and education. I think that's important. I think having members of Congress back in their districts talking about this issue, helping to educate local leaders, community leaders and officials, appearing with members of the Jewish community, All of that seems to me very important in order to send a message that anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, that anti-Israelism, that anti-Zionism is something that decent people do not tolerate. And when Columbia University, for example, invites somebody who is an outspoken anti-Semite and names him as a global leader, I would love to see the member of Congress from that district speak up about that kind of situation.
Anti-Semitic materials proliferated long before the internet. It didn't take Facebook for the Protocols of the Elders of Zion to be a worldwide bestseller and available in every country in the world. Indeed, with the internet now, I think it is easier for people to find things out, to educate themselves and find out that, for example, this document is not an actual Protocols of the Elders of Zion. I testified last year, or earlier this year, in the Senate on the question of regulating such speech online. We have to remember, things on Facebook, just like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, are protected by the First Amendment. They're speech. At the same time, as Mr. Greenblatt pointed out, the Communications Decency Act contains various protections and carve-outs for tech companies which are not required by the First Amendment, which are discretionary grants by Congress, and can be reevaluated if it does not seem they have been using those benefits wisely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll now go to my colleague, the ranking member, Mr. Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, there's no question that anti-Semitism is rising around the world. Mr. May, what are you all seeing in Europe and elsewhere in terms of anti-Semitic rhetoric and violence?
Quite a bit of anti-Semitic violence, quite a bit of anti-Semitic rhetoric in much of Western Europe. And what else, and the other thing that's going on that you should be aware of is that crimes against Jews are being treated differently than crimes against other groups or minorities.
How do you come to that conclusion?
Well, I mentioned one where a woman in France was murdered, and not the suspect, the person who committed that murder has been let off, and he's been let off because he was smoking marijuana, and that made him not responsible. That I do not think that would happen very often. We had in 2017 there was a lower court in Germany. It upheld a lower court's sentencing of three Palestinians had set fire to a synagogue. It was the same synagogue that had been burned during Kristallnacht in 1938 during that pogrom, which preceded the final solution. The court decided that the perpetrators should be released without punishment because they were incensed about Israel's actions in the Middle East, and so their act of arson didn't constitute anti-Semitism. It was just a protest. In Belgium last year, a French-born jihadist was found guilty of murdering an Israeli couple and two staffers at a Jewish museum in Brussels. His lawyer claimed the attack was actually a targeted execution by agents of the Mossad. He did not bother to present any evidence. There's a list of these.
Yes.
I could go on where you can really see that what's happening in Europe is very dangerous, and as a result, the Jewish community feels very threatened in Europe.
Thank you for the answer. I've got about 3 minutes, so I want to get as much as I can in. Mr. Kontorovich, first of all, thank you for cutting your trip to Israel short and coming back just for this panel. We appreciate you being here. In your opinion, has international anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic terrorism contributed to the rise of anti-Semitism in the United States?
The phenomenons go hand in hand. The motivations differ. Again, every anti-Semite is coming from a different place, from the left, from the right, but to the extent that the demonization of Jews and putting them beyond the pale, making them particularly legitimate objects of hate, to the extent that that idea becomes mainstream or becomes accepted for any reason, then anti-Semites of all stripes, including every kind of violent anti-Semite you might find in America, can attach themselves to that.
Okay. Speaking on that topic, how would you recommend, or should you recommend, the United States push back against anti-Semitism around the globe? Is that something that could restrict it even here?
So, for example, my comments about efforts to single out Israel for boycotts and companies doing business in Israel for boycotts, that is a global effort. And to the extent that it's found in America, it's part of broader efforts in Europe and internationally, and measures like the Anti-Israel Boycott Act, which would push back on the extraordinary effort of the UN to make a list of companies doing business in Israel that are on a blacklist, and similar boycott efforts. These are crucial, and these are where Congress can really take the lead.
A couple yes and no questions for the panel, and I'll go right to left, starting with Mr. Kontorovich. Do you believe that anti-Semitism comes from many different ideological drivers?
Yes.
Mr. May?
Oh, yes.
Mr. Diamond? Mr. Greenblatt? Mr. Kontorovich, based on your testimony, it sounds like that you believe the BDS movement is fundamentally anti-Semitic. Do you believe that?
That's correct.
Mr. May?
I do.
Mr. Diamond?
Yes.
Mr. Greenblatt?
I think the people who are responsible for the movement are indeed anti-Semitic. I think the outcomes that BDS campaigns often generate are anti-Semitic as well. Sometimes there are college kids or other people get caught up in the issue who might not realize what it's all about.
Okay, but you said at the very core you would agree with the colleagues?
BDS is a tactic in the broader movement of delegitimization that is inherently anti-Semitic.
Mr. May, why do you reject BDS advocates who say they only want Israel to change its policies toward Palestinians?
Yes, I do reject that. One of what we have some history here. Israel pulled out of Gaza entirely in 2005. That was one of the two occupied territories, so-called. I would call them disputed territories. Israel had taken Gaza from Egypt, not from the Palestinians. Israel said, okay, we will leave. After they left, what happened? Gaza has become since a platform for terrorism against Israel completely. If Israel were to leave the West Bank without security guarantees, were simply to pull out, what would happen is Israel would have missiles and mortars fired on Tel Aviv at close proximity, Jerusalem and the international airport. Israel would have to go back in there. It would be bloody for Palestinians and Israelis. Smart BDS advocates know this. They simply do not care.
And my last comment here, it makes me pause for a minute and think of my African-American brothers and sisters who can relate to some of the things that you guys are going through. And I'd also like to say a special thank you to Mr. Peter King. In his last term, there's been no stronger voice against such in Congress, and I'm honored to follow in his shoes. And also welcome Lee Zeldin, a strong voice to our committee as well. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. I ask unanimous consent for Mr. Zeldin and Mr. Raskin to sit and ask questions of the witnesses. Great. We will move on to Ms. Jackson Lee from Texas.
Let me thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me thank all of the witnesses who are here today, and acknowledge that this committee has certainly been at the forefront of dealing with some of the heinous acts that we have had to endure. But enduring is not the same thing of losing your life. Enduring is not the same thing as having your religious services violated. And enduring is not the same thing of being afraid to wear your religious attire, to walk the streets of any city in this nation. And I'm reminded, having known Mrs. Evers, Mrs. Medgar Evers, having known her for a good number of years, she has never forgotten to remind us of what it was like to see Medgar Evers gunned down in the front yard of their home in front of their children. Searing, unforgetting, and unforgetful. And as well, to see and to be reminded of the 3 boys in Mississippi that symbolize the violence of that time. There were people during that era that were afraid to come out, afraid to walk, afraid to gather. And of course, America rallied to be able to use, remember, the Department of Justice in an effective manner, to utilize what presence of federal marshals and other federal entities that could be used to come to the Deep South, to be able to break the chains of absolute fear. What about the bombing of the 3 little girls in a Birmingham church? And I hesitate to say, but I'm going to say it, how tragic that we're returning to that fear today in 21st century America, where we have celebrated the richness of diversity of our nation, where we have celebrated the variety of faith, the Jewish faith, and people from the Jewish faith, or who happen to be Jewish, who are taking their rightful place in athletics and education and politics. Unique, I believe, and if my facts are correct, it might be the first Jewish Speaker of the House in the state of Virginia, along with some of the uniqueness of where Latinos are, in spite of the policies that have been undermining them. And then, of course, dealing with our African-American community, but our Muslim community and mosques that have been attacked. So I believe that it is time now that we look to the civil rights movement as a model, certainly passed the legislation of my chairman, Chairman Thompson, and the energy of Chairman Rose and our other members. It's time for us to act. We need to enhance and write legislation dealing with the reporting. We need to take the language of see something, say something, to be dealing with the religious issues in this era. We need to also, something that I intend to take up, is to enhance the training of law enforcement to detect and to be effective in their review of anti-Semitism and other antis as relates to religion. That they need to have their antenna. There needs to be segments in these local law enforcement that deal specifically with these issues. Why? Because there is an uptick. And the way I say this is because we're dealing with this offensive sign. Can you imagine? This little circle that was innocent, we thought. Here it is in the center of this is Roger Stone. Then we see it in the Kavanaugh hearings, where people are utilizing this. We are told that this is a symbol of white nationalism. So let me ask you, gentlemen, and I might, if you could go straight across to starting with the first witness. What is the value of enhancing and upticking the sensitivity to this dangerous behavior and calling it what it is? Reporting, special training for law enforcement, certainly legislation for enhanced security.
So this is, Congressman, thank you for the question. This is a big area of focus for ADL. We do advocacy, education, and we work with law enforcement. Today, we are the largest trainer of law enforcement in the United States on extremism and hate. We train 15,000 officers every year. We train the FBI recruits in Quantico. We train the whole NYPD. We train large and small, federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies to recognize hate and to be sensitive to what's a hate crime. How's it different than a regular crime? What are the trends of the extremists? And I would point out that the Jabara Hire No Hate Act calls for, which is in working through committee right now, calls for ensuring that law enforcement is trained up across the country on how to recognize and deal with hate, and that they report on it. Because keep in mind, even though we have some very solid data, as does the FBI, hate crimes are still massively underreported. So there's work to be done to make sure that all law enforcement is complying with the law and reporting on this to the FBI.
Thank you. Mr. Diamond, can you also add in there the importance of a domestic terrorism law dealing with white nationalism and other acts?
Yes, indeed. Again, in the course of my service on the DHS Advisory Committee, which you'll hear from our co-chairs on the next panel, one of the messages we consistently heard from leaders in the federal and local law enforcement communities is that you could have somebody coming into this country from overseas, engaging in certain activities, and because there are anti-terrorism laws that are in place, the FBI could open an investigation, it could conduct surveillance, et cetera, and disrupt or thwart, a possible plot. Whereas if American citizens engage in those very same activities, they have an impediment in the absence of a federal domestic terrorism statute to be able to respond in the same way. I know there are a lot of complexities around a domestic terrorism statute, but that's what they pay you all the big money for and give you these nice daises for. And I can tell you from not just the Jewish community perspective, but that from interacting with the Muslim communities and other faith communities that really feel under a lot of pressure right now, we need to work together and figure out a way that is respectful of civil liberties, but will also address the challenge at hand, which is not only coming from overseas, but is coming, sadly, from within our borders as well.
Let me...
I will just say that I think your concerns are well placed. And in my written testimony, you'll find recommendations regarding law enforcement and education that I think could strengthen within my colleagues, and I think could strengthen both of those areas.
Okay.
Thank you so very much. I yield back,
you,
Mr.
ma'am.
Chairman. Thank you.
Now move on to Mr. King from the great state of New York.
Okay, thank you. I thought maybe Max was trying to cut me off. Staten Island guys. First of all, let me thank all of you for your testimony. And the concern I have is I still don't think with all the testimony we've heard at various times, and understanding why there's this dramatic increase in anti-Semitism now. Obviously, we can blame white nationalism, and Mr. Greenberg, I think your point is well taken also. We should look to see if there's a connection between white nationalists here in this country and also in Europe, and to the extent that that's having an impact. But also, we just had a whole series of anti-Semitic attacks, including murder in New York, and not one of them was carried out by a white person.
Right.
You look at the BDS movement, which is, we talk about educating people, yet the BDS movement to a large extent is on campus, and these are the most educated people. So it seems it's coming from all different directions. And why at this time? I mean, none of the excuses that were used in the past for anti-Semitism, you know, a terrible economy or some incident that would somehow allow demagogues to talk about anti-Semitism. None of those elements are as present today as they were in the past. Why now do we see it coming from so many different quarters?
So I'll try to answer that, and again, I think my colleagues may have thoughts. So number one, I do think we're in an environment where anti-Semitism has been normalized or destigmatized. Again, we see it when people say that Jews have dual loyalty or that it's all about the Benjamins on one side, or when people say that the globalists are trying to take over Congress and that Jewish financiers are trying to destroy our borders. And people don't call it out, and they say it's okay. So number one, I think it's infecting the public conversation, Congressman, in a way that just wasn't happening a few years ago, number one. Number two, indeed, I think there are fringe groups, as there always have been, you know, that will take this and act on violent impulses, and social media is allowing crazy ideas to spread in a way that just wasn't possible a few years ago. I mean, keep in mind, we tracked on YouTube a series of anti-Semitic channels that over the course of this year, are you ready, we found 5, they were viewed 81 million times. Off-the-wall content that, honestly, you couldn't find anywhere. It's not like there wasn't a Protocols of the Elders of Zion, but you couldn't buy it at Barnes & Noble. Now I can go to Amazon, and with one click as a Prime member, it's in my living room the next day. So again, social has got something to do with this. Number 3, the guilt of the Holocaust and its memory is fading, and that's allowing, again, I think, bad ideas to come into the center. So those are just some ideas that I think why we're in this very charged moment. And the last thing I'll just say is in a polarized world, there is indeed a lot of anxiety. And systems aren't providing the solutions, the political system, the marketplace, and in those moments when there's anxiety and a lack of answers, people latch on to easy solutions, to stereotypes, to slander, to explain away their problems. And that's when the anti-Semites move from the margins right into the mainstream.
Yeah.
I would just try to add very briefly that, again, as I tried to say in my opening comments, that particularly in the Orthodox community, I unfortunately have to say that I think we've been a subset of the broader Jewish community, and that leaders of communities who've engaged in anti-Orthodox statements and actions have not been repudiated and called out the way anti-Semites, you know, more generally have been, and as the examples I gave in my testimony. And I think so. The fact that we're now realizing that and responding to that is unfortunate but welcome. The second thing, just to add to Jonathan's point about social media, again, one of the things that my co-chairs on the next panel can talk about in more detail, one of the things we heard from the head of the office at the Secret Service that engages in the analysis and profiling of potential criminal actors is that social media has really condensed what they call, the moment of inspiration to action, and is really the timeline for radicalization of ideas to action has just been so condensed and accelerated by social media and the internet as well.
Cliff?
Let me just mention that for centuries, indeed millennia, Jews have been convenient scapegoats, and they still are convenient scapegoats for very many groups. Again, on the right and the left, Islamist supremacists and others. We also have, just reemphasize, the United Nations, which continually, day after day, pours out anti-Israeli and really anti-Semitic resolutions and rhetoric. It was very useful, I think, when we had Nikki Haley as ambassador, because she stood up to this on a regular basis. By the way, Senator Moynihan, who I had the privilege of knowing when he was ambassador to the United Nations, I knew when he was a senator, he also stood up against anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism and was a model. I think it would be good for this body to encourage in any way you think is appropriate the current ambassador to the United Nations, Ambassador Kelly Craft, also to make this a priority and stand up to the constant flow of poisonous rhetoric coming out of that body right there in New York City.
Mr. King, I think your question is a fantastic question, and it's a deep question. Why now? And I want to say professors like to explain everything, but one important thing in social science is deep and complicated human phenomenon don't always have an explanation. And everyone wants to say, oh, this is happening because they read the right-wing website, the left-wing website. It could be they did that maybe, but they also probably had breakfast, and the breakfast didn't make it happen either. Why these things happen, why these strange movements of people, uncoordinated, happen at different times, is very hard to know, but we know that there are countries where there are no Jews, and yet surveys suggest deep anti-Semitic views. They've never seen a Jew. Why is that? And that is why anti-Semitism needs to be treated with particular sensitivity, because it's something deep, because it's something atavistic. It's something that's always with us. I think and that is why it may be a mistake to lump it in with, all other isms, all other antis, because anti-Semitism is something that is just always with us and comes in strange waves and motions, and we need to be able to deal with it even if we can't fully understand it.
Thank you very much. I yield back. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. King. Next up is Ms. Slotkin from the great state of Michigan. We'd also like to formally commend her for her entire professional life taking part in the fight against terror, both abroad and here at home.
Thank you, Chairman. So thank you for doing this panel. I think you can see there's strong support. When you can get bipartisan members of Congress to stay through an entire hearing and ask interested and engaged questions, you know that you're on a topic that has really strong bipartisan support and interest, so thank you. We have been reading the materials, and we've all been talking about a fourfold increase in victims of violent anti-Semitism in the past 2 years, according to Mr. Greenblatt's testimony. On top of the vandalism, the harassment, in Michigan, we've seen the same precipitous rise in anti-Semitism, including a synagogue that was defaced, and the Michigan State University Hillel, which I represent, was defaced. So this is an issue that's very much on my mind and in our hearts. But I am a CIA analyst and by training. And so while I respect the view and certainly have lived the experience that anti-Semitism is as old as the world, we can't dance around the idea that there's been a precipitous increase. And so I'm interested, in order to fix the problem, we have to understand what is at the root of the problem. So we've talked about this idea of mainstreaming. Mr. May, you spoke about it. Mr. Greenblatt, you spoke about it. Explain to me how it's become mainstreamed. We had social media 15 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, but we've had a precipitous rise in the past couple of years in these incidents. And we know some of the most violent incidents, the shootings in California and in Pittsburgh, were centered around a conspiracy theory that probably should have never seen the light of day, that was the basis of their desire to enact violence on people. So explain to me, particularly the role of leadership in mainstreaming anti-Semitism. Mr. Greenblatt and then Mr. May, and as crisp as you can, if you could.
Yeah, look, so anti-Semitism, as has been said, is sometimes called the oldest hatred. It isn't new. I mean, over the last decade, if we try to pull back a little bit, at the ADL, we tracked some 220 extremist murders in the United States. 200 of which were committed by extreme right-wing elements like white supremacists, anti-government activists. That's 200 in the last decade. 12 by Islamist radical jihadists, and 8 by radical left-wing types. So I want to just point out that the violence didn't just start, but what we saw in 2016 was a dramatic increase after anti-Semitic incidents had been on the decline over 15 years. 2016, it went up 34%, 2017, 57%, and then as you're pointing out, in 2018, anti-Semitic assaults more than doubled year over year, and the victims tripled. So something's going on. And I think to your point, the idea that conspiracism has now become part of the political kind of parlance is deeply problematic. And we see terms like globalists or open borders or all of the crazy intonations against George Soros that he's paying migrants to come from Central America. Just so you understand, these ideas are not new. They are lifted from the pages of white supremacists. They are laundered through services like 4chan and 8chan, to Reddit and Facebook, and to the talking points of political pundits on primetime television. So I'll just say, number one, that has a lot to do with it, because this is the stuff that feeds the deranged. And I'll also point out that the crazy ideas that somehow, again, that the Jews control Congress or that Israel is behind all the machinations feeds an equally odious narrative that comes from a different ideological direction. And when it goes unchallenged, when it goes unresponded to, it settles into the conversation.
So, Mr. May, help us understand the role of leadership in this. And please, I have 50 seconds left.
So really quickly, I think you're absolutely right to put your finger on the role of leadership. Leadership has not done what it should do. Why didn't the president of the Columbia University say we shouldn't be having recognizing as a global leader somebody who is an open anti-Semite? Why was that not done? The anti-Semitism in form ends up justifying violence in anti-Semitism, and this is going on all over the world. There's a legislation passed in Ireland, it's not yet law, that would say it's illegal for people in Ireland to do business with Jews in the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem. They think this is a way of protest to Israel, but they're saying Jews in the Jewish quarter, we will not do business with that. I think that needs to be addressed by our leadership. I can give you other examples of this as well, but leadership is very important. It sends signals.
Is the leadership of the President of the United States important, sir?
It's very important.
I think my time has expired, so I won't go on.
Thank you, Ms.
Mr. Chairman, I have just 10 seconds to say something.
Sure.
On the issue of Ireland, as an Irish American, what they are doing is absolutely disgraceful and despicable, and I've actually officially complained to them about it. No,
I know you have.
Inexcusable.
I do know you've been involved in that.
Mr. King, thank you very much. Next up is Mr. Zeldin from New York.
Well, thank you, Chairman, for hosting this hearing. It's an honor to be here, and a very timely topic. So thank you to the chair and also to all the witnesses who are here for both panels. First off, there are a few pieces of legislation that I'm supportive of that I believe Congress can pass to assist. One is the Never Again Education Act, H.R. 943, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, H.R. 4009, Israel Anti-Boycott Act, H.R. 5595, and S1, which contains the Combating BDS Act for the millions of Americans who are watching us live on C-SPAN right now. The public service announcement of January 24th is International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Just a few days later is, on January 27th, is the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And earlier this week in my office, I met with the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief. The Special Rapporteur came out with a report that touched on this topic, and it encourages the Secretary General to appoint a senior level leader in the executive office of the Secretary General with the responsibility for engaging with Jewish communities worldwide, as well as for monitoring anti-Semitism and the response of the United Nations. So as I heard Mr. May and others talking about the United Nations specifically, I think it would be great for the Secretary General to act on that recommendation made by the Special Rapporteur. Mr. Greenblatt, I think it would be helpful for the Committee for Congress, for our country, to get a little more of a historical perspective on there was an executive order that was signed a few weeks back, And some people were just becoming familiar with the issue as the executive order was first being signed. But what a lot of people don't realize is the bipartisan historical context over the course of the last several years, and why I really do believe that more Americans, regardless of political affiliations, not just should be aware of that historical context, but should be supportive of the underlying substance.
Sure. So first of all, Congressman, thank you for the question. Thank you for your leadership on the Never Again Education Act. We also agree that it should be passed forthright, so I'm glad you brought that up. So we think the executive order that was signed by the president just a few weeks ago is incredibly important, in large part because it indeed has a bipartisan history. So to step back, I think, as Mr. May pointed out, we do have a legitimate issue with Jewish students being marginalized on college campuses because of their quote-unquote support of Israel. That's often the pretext. But I've heard stories about kids afraid to go to Hillel because they'll be excluded from certain parts of campus, because they'll be marginalized in certain groups. I mean, it's, if you'll forgive me, off the wall. Now, the challenge is that the Department of Education, which has an Office of Civil Rights, has never in its history, prior to just a few weeks ago, taken up a case of a Jewish student's civil rights being violated. And so during the Bush administration, there was a directive, a decision rendered that OCR should look at these violations of Jewish student civil rights. And let me just step back, because Title 9 does, pardon? Title 6, excuse me, doesn't, it lays out that it protects people on the basis of race, religion, or national origin. So does it exclude Jews? Sometimes they're considered a race. Does it exclude Jews? So the Bush administration found no, it should not, because often Jews are targeted in the same way people are of a particular race or national origin. And so that decision was challenged and then reinforced by the Obama administration's Justice Department and said, yes, indeed, Jews like Sikhs or Muslims are often considered a distinct ethnic group and should be protected by Title VI. So what the EO does is simply codify, coming from the White House, that it is time to actually enforce that. Honestly, it's more symbolic than anything, because it simply reiterates what the Obama and Bush administrations had found. But it also does something very important, in as much as it recognizes the Ira definition of anti-Semitism. So Ira stands for the International Holocaust Remembrance Association. This is a group of academics. This is a group of professors and scholars. There's no politics in this group, from many countries around the world, who including the United States, over several years developed this definition. And so the EO codifies the definition and reinforces where the Bush and Obama administrations are. At the end of the day, it's about how universities enforce their own policies. And hopefully this will help them understand, if you don't protect the civil rights of Jewish students like you would Muslims or African Americans or Latinos, then you might be at risk of losing federal funding. That's a good thing in this environment.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Greenblatt, and hopefully it's a topic that really we can make progress in breaking down barriers, because it really started as a work product of Republicans and Democrats in Congress, Republicans and Democrats, nonpartisans outside of Congress. I know, Mr. Greenblatt, you were involved in that effort.
It builds on the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which passed unanimously in the Senate and was moving with bipartisan support through the House until it was held up in the last session. So you're absolutely right, a long bipartisan basis for this.
Thank you.
Mr. Zeldin, thank you. We'll now move on to Mr. Langevin from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. I want to thank our witnesses for your testimony here today. I find the rise and spread of anti-Semitism extremely troubling, and I think it's important that all of us call it out and condemn it as often as possible, and not be silent. In your testimony, Mr. Greenblatt, you mentioned that the FBI data on hate crimes is based on voluntary local law enforcement reporting, and I agree with you that we cannot fully understand what we cannot measure, and in this case, unfortunately, the trend in reporting seems to be falling rather than increasing. So in your view, how can we go about improving the fidelity of this data? Is it primarily a matter of better identifying hate crimes at the state and local level, or do LEAs have these data but just not reporting them to the FBI?
So there are a few things. So I think, number one, indeed, the integrity of the data matters so much, Congressman. I mean, we can't manage what we don't measure. And the fact is that some 80+% of law enforcement agencies around the country actually don't report hate crimes at all. So why don't they do that? Maybe the law enforcement isn't adequately trained up to recognize the difference between a hate crime and an ordinary offense. Maybe number two, it's too much paperwork and they don't want to deal with it at the police desk. Maybe number three, they're afraid it will affect badly on their community. But this is the purpose of the No Hate Act that's moving right now through the House. It is indeed to ensure that law enforcement is adequately trained and adequately tracks hate crimes against any marginalized group. If we better understand the issue, if we're better counting it, we'll be able to more effectively correct for it.
And I want to just be clear, you did you say 80%?
It's like 87%, I think. It's massive. Now, just to be clear, most of the major metropolitan areas do report, but there are many large ones like Honolulu reports 0 hate crimes a year. And there are other large metros that simply don't report at all. I can assure you there was probably a hate crime in Honolulu at some point over the past 12 months. But again, law enforcement does so much good. We work so closely with them. With better training and resources, they can get this done.
Thank you for that conversation and perspective. Ms. Diamant or Mr. Greenblatt, we've seen in many of these anti-Semitic attacks that there's often been linked to extremist activity online in the message boards or in social media. We've talked about that, both in your testimony and this conversation here already. But can you expand on your view and your estimation? How would you judge the work of social media platforms? Again, we've talked about this already, but to expand on that. And what should their role be in helping to stem extremist content? The challenge is some of these social media platforms say they are a platform. Others would argue that they are ostensibly publishers and they should be held to a higher standard. And so what should their role be in helping to stem extremist content? And should their focus be on moderating content directly or removing consistent bad actors from their platforms?
Well, I appreciate that, Nathan. Look, I think it's worth noting that the companies have taken some steps. YouTube has taken down extremist channels. Facebook has taken down extremist accounts. Twitter has introduced policies. Reddit has quarantined problematic users. Google has used sort of data boxes when you do certain searches. So there's steps they've done, but they haven't done nearly enough. The 81 million views I described that we found on those YouTube channels, 4 out of the 5 channels are still up today. The kind of op-ed you could never post, you could never publish in any newspaper in America, you can post with almost instantaneously on Facebook. The kind of videos that you could never show on any broadcast network, you can post instantly to YouTube, right? So the reach and the instantaneousness of it is really unnatural. There's no natural law that says when I post a video, it should show up automatically. That isn't ordained by God. And keep in mind that the shooter in Christchurch, the shooter in Halle, they live streamed the shootings. So again, I think the companies need to exercise a kind of moral authority and live by some of the same standards that they should impose themselves that, again, broadcast, print, radio, other media live by these standards. And frankly, although there's room for improvement, they work pretty well. If the companies can protect copyright, if the companies can go after sex trafficking, the companies can do a better job of addressing hate speech. And if they won't do it, you need to step up. And as Professor Counterterrorism said, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act holds them to a different standard than all traditional media. It's time to look at that and assess. If they won't answer the problem, you probably need to.
Very good. Thank you all. I appreciate your perspective on this and the work you're doing to call attention to this. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next up is Ms. Clark from the greatest city in the world, New York City.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I thank our ranking member, Mr. Walker. I thank all of our expert witnesses who have testified before us today. It is not enough to live in America where we are assured the right that we can practice our religions freely. We must live our lives free from fear. Just a few weeks ago, the attack at the Hanukkah celebration in my state of New York was a vivid reminder that the ancient evil of anti-Semitism still exists, and sadly, it doesn't just exist, it's on the rise. In Jersey City, San Diego, and Pittsburgh, we've seen the death toll of these hateful ideologies grow larger and larger. In fact, Pittsburgh was the deadliest act of domestic terrorism on the Jewish community in America's history, killing 11 people simply observing Shabbat. In my district, the Brooklyn and Crown Heights communities, we've also seen violent hate crimes occur in rapid succession and with alarming frequency. We must reject hate, and we must take action to confront it. Anti-Semitism has no place in our society. My first question, Mr. Diamant, is tragically the Orthodox Jewish community has often been disproportionate target of anti-Semitic violence. We've seen this in my own district, my own community where I live, and I'm deeply concerned about the recent spat of violent attacks in communities like Midwood and in Crown Heights. As you stated in your opening testimony, the very fact that many Orthodox Jews wear visible markers of their religion may put them at risk, which is totally unacceptable. In your view, how can and should government officials provide support specific to the needs and issues facing Orthodox communities in order to protect them against violence?
Thank you for your strong statement, Congresswoman Clark. And I think, as I said earlier, I think in the short term, to use your words, people need to be free from fear. And in the short term, while we're in this crisis, and it is a crisis, we need better policing. I mean, the NYPD does a wonderful job, but I suspect they could even they could use more resources to really provide the level of police protection that our communities need. And the communities themselves need more resources in terms of making our synagogues and our schools and other places that we gather more secure. Just to give you a ballpark figure, to hire a contract security guard from a private company at $40 a week, right? That's $360 a week for a single security guard, and you multiply that out. That's not something that your typical small synagogue has in its budget and was contemplating, let alone dramatic physical infrastructure improvements like shatterproof glass and surveillance cameras and controlled entries and so on and so forth. The Nonprofit Security Grant Program has been a wonderful resource for that. But sadly, more synagogues and more churches and more mosques need those resources to make their congregants more secure.
Mr. Diamond, I think that we've been having those conversations with our municipal and state partners in New York City, and I think that the message has been received. Mr. Greenblatt and Mr. Diamond, the distinction between the real world and the virtual world is blurring. Anti-Semitic rhetoric on the internet can and does inspire actual deadly attacks. In your estimation, how have the mainstream social media companies done so far? I know you mentioned it a bit, and what can Congress do to help rein in hate speech on platforms like 8chan?
So I would give the mainstream companies pretty poor marks. Again, they've done some things, but not enough. So you have the public platforms like Facebook and Google and YouTube and Twitter. Then you have what I'll call private platforms, 4chan, 8chan, Discord, Minds. And particularly like 8chan and 4chan, Congresswoman, they don't obey any rules. They have almost weaponized the First Amendment to target marginalized people. They allow the kind of sexual predators, horrific bigots, the worst elements of society up there. And yeah, I think it's long overdue to take action. And I think these companies don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in a value chain. And so we should say to the financial institutions which allow them up, do you financial institutions want to work with companies that peddle this kind of garbage? the cybersecurity companies, the hosting companies, the domain names providers. Again, there are ways that we can encourage companies to behave a degree of moral leadership if those particular firms won't do any at all. So I think it's long overdue for this to happen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Ms. Clark, thank you. Next up is Ms. Rice, also from the great estate, New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Greenblatt, we have a time constraint here, but recently I met with a group of high school students and survivors who take part in UJA's Witness Project. And it was so incredibly moving that these high school kids meet with the survivors and hear the stories directly, so that, because there's going to come a time in the not so distant future when there will be no more survivors, and who will tell their story. And if you look at the statistics of the percentage of people who either don't know about the Holocaust, literally don't know about it, or don't believe it, the aspect of this from an educational standpoint, to me, is the single, other than politicians like us and people in the public discourse watching what we say and not feeding this rise in anti-Semitism, it is ensuring that this is taught as a fact of history and not just some tall tale. So if you could just talk more about that.
Congresswoman Rice, I mean, I think what you're pointing out is really important. So we know that our own high school students do incredibly poorly in terms of their basic civics. So it shouldn't surprise us that the majority don't even know what Auschwitz was, right? And again, as was mentioned by my colleagues, the Shoah stands out as the most, probably the most horrific act, not just of the 20th century, but in the history of humanity. And the idea that as we lose these survivors, we lose the memory of the Shoah is unconscionable. So I think, as mentioned a few times, the Never Again Holocaust Education Act is really important. Every American student should be educated about Holocaust and genocide. What can happen when hate goes unchecked? What it means when law enforcement and government, the instruments of the state, are used as tools to target, to persecute, and to murder people because of how they pray or who they love or where they're from. So we deeply believe in this. I think if we're ever going to get our arms around anti-Semitism, we can't arrest our way out of the problem. And we really can't lobby or legislate it. We need to change hearts and minds. That's why, every year we reach over 1 million school children with our anti-bias education programs. There are other excellent organizations like Facing History and the SPLC that do really good programs around this. But I would challenge you today. You should get that act passed so that every American student to operate in an increasingly diverse country in an increasingly global world gets educated about bias and hate. I think it's the minimum that we can give to our kids if we ever really want to inoculate them from intolerance.
Challenge accepted. Thank you very much.
Ms. Rice, thank you, and I apologize that we're speeding things up a bit. Mr. Raskin from Maryland, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, the great state of Maryland. Surely you meant that. Let's see. But I want to start with you, Mr. Greenblatt. We are now in an election year, and I know that ADL makes a point, as you just observed a few moments ago, of calling out anti-Semitism when you see it and not allowing it to become part of the fabric of everyday existence. And I remember clearly in 2016 when ADL blew the whistle on Donald Trump's closing TV ad in the 2016 campaign, which had focused on George Soros, Lloyd Blankfein, and Janet Yellen, and said, essentially, these people are globalists who are exploiting the American people. And I'm wondering, do you take special precautions in election years to try to contact campaigns or political parties to talk about the use of anti-Semitic tropes and themes, or what do you do to make sure that we're not going to see that further kind of degradation of our political discourse?
So, Congressman, I think it's a very good question. So we're a 501c3 organization, and as a tax-exempt organization, we don't get involved in politics. I don't really care how any of you vote. I care what you value, right? I don't care kind of what lever you pull. I care whether or not you push prejudice. So indeed, in 2016, we called out candidates when they said things that were beyond the pale. And when you make claims that there's, again, a global conspiracy and you point the finger at only Jews as driving that, forgive me, but that gets our attention. No matter who's saying it, and no matter what the consequences are of speaking out. That being said, indeed, I worry as we move into this political cycle, we have candidates on both sides of the aisle. We have both political parties who've engaged, or certain members have, with a kind of rhetoric that I think doesn't belong in our political conversation. So we do take great pains to be even-handed. We will call it when we see it. And I think, for me, that's a good way to conclude, because what gives me great hope today is after Charlottesville, you had members of Congress, you had members of the Senate, you had governors on both sides who called this out clearly and consistently. And over the last year and a half, from the mayor of Pittsburgh to the governor of New York, to many of you, members of the New York delegation, and relative to the attacks we've seen the last few months, you have called this out clearly and consistently. As the grandson of a Holocaust survivor who lost his entire family in Nazi Germany, when the government was, attempted to murder all of European Jewry, as the husband of a political refugee from the Middle East, a government from Iran, a government that is the worst state sponsor of anti-Semitism in the world, that has instrumentalized it as the chief plank of its foreign policy. I can tell you it makes a difference when people in positions of authority speak out, and I applaud all of you for doing just that.
Thank you. And Mr. Diamond, if I'm not mistaken, you're still my constituent? This is wonderful to hear. A lot of my constituents are terrified by the rise in anti-Semitic violence, and especially parents of small kids, especially if they go to Jewish schools and so on. And I know that this is something that's of great concern in the Orthodox community. What special precautions are being taken now, and what more do you think the government can be doing to enhance people's sense of security against the resurgence in anti-Semitic terror and violence?
Thank you for your question. My congressman, just to be fair, I should say, my sister lives in Ms. Rice's district, and my parents live in Mr. King's district. In terms of precautions, there are a range of precautions that my organization, as the umbrella for synagogues around the country, are undertaking. They range from assisting our congregations with becoming educated on and applying for the grants for security improvements that are available both from the federal government and from state and local governments. We also have been working with local congregations in terms of developing best practices for training the congregants of what to do in should there be an unfortunate and emergency situation. Many of our congregations have volunteers who are standing outside synagogues and have been trained on how to be watchful in sort of a see something, say something kind of context. And so that's what we're doing in terms of our congregational life. As I said earlier, there's a lot of anxiety around this, but I don't think we're going to cower in fear. We are a resilient community, and perhaps because, sadly, there have been centuries of anti-Semitism, we have the resiliency and the courage to work with people of goodwill and government leaders who care to try to push this back and say, no, we're not going to be fearful. We're going to exercise our freedom of religion in this country.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Raskin, thank you very much. With that, we thank the witnesses of our first panel for their extraordinary testimony, especially because Mr. Miller scheduled his plane like a true New Yorker. We ask that we move expeditiously to the second panel. Thank you so much again. Yeah, it's all right. Okay, we welcome the second panel of witnesses. Our first witness is Mr. John Miller, Deputy Commissioner for Intelligence and Counterterrorism at the New York City Police Department, the greatest police department in the history of the world. We thank the men in blue. We'll jump right to you because I know you're a bit pressed for time.
Thank you for the understated introduction, and it's good to be back. Good afternoon, Chairman Rose, Ranking Member Walker, and members of the subcommittee. I'm John Miller, Deputy Commissioner for Intelligence and Counterterrorism of the New York City Police Department. On behalf of Commissioner Shea and Mayor de Blasio, I'm pleased to testify before your subcommittee to discuss the disturbing rise in bias crimes, especially anti-Semitic violence, as well as the NYPD's efforts to address that. An attack on a member of a particular community targeted because of their race, religion, nationality, gender, or sexual orientation is an attack on all New Yorkers. New York City is the world epicenter of diversity and stands as an example of how distinct cultures, religions, nationalities can exist side by side, learning from one another and enriching each other. Unfortunately, last year in New York City, we saw 428 hate crimes. That's a 20% increase in hate crimes over 2018, which in and of itself is concerning, and a 26% increase in anti-Semitic hate crimes, which comprised a majority of the total hate crimes in our city. That would be 234 anti-Semitic hate crimes. Now, we see that the lion's share of that number are things like graffiti, a broken window, a property crime as a hate crime. These are very challenging to solve because oftentimes nobody knows when it occurred or who did it or how long it's been there. It is a challenge when these things are in bathrooms or in a school classroom or in a wall to find video evidence or witnesses. However, I would underline in the much smaller percentage that involve an assault, a physical attack on another person, our clearance rate there, our solve rate, if you will, is over 80%. So that's significant. We put a lot of work into those. We pull out all the stops. By now, you have all heard of the brutal machete attack in Muncie, New York, just miles north of the city, which injured 5, one very seriously. These were people peacefully and happily celebrating Hanukkah, and the brutal attack and the shootout in Jersey City you also heard of, which killed 6, including a police officer, Joe Seals. It turned a quiet neighborhood into a battlefield in an afternoon. But these days, it also seems like every news cycle carries yet another story of violence targeted at Jewish New Yorkers including children. So what are we doing about it in New York City? What are we doing about it specifically as the NYPD? First of all, we're ramping up our uniform presence in the city, particularly in neighborhoods that have been targeted by anti-Semitic violence. The first line of defense is our most valuable asset in the NYPD and the fight against violent extremism. That's our highly trained, dedicated, and extraordinarily diverse personnel of the NYPD. They collectively make up our department, and they make it stronger because the NYPD has worked very hard for a long time to stand up a force of officers who reflect the city that they are charged with policing. And we're succeeding. In a majority-minority city, the department is now a majority-minority police force, with each subsequent graduating police academy class reinforcing that trend. We now have members of the service hailing from 161 different countries and 22,382 members who speak more than one language, with 168 languages represented among them. That is encouraged by the support of a myriad of fraternal organizations across all of those ethnicities, religions, and language. We embrace our diversity in New York City. We embrace our diversity as the NYPD. We expend significant resources to ensure those who commit crimes motivated by hate are apprehended and brought to justice. The numbers bear that out. Last year, hate crime apprehensions increased by 38% for the most serious offenses: criminal possession of a weapon, criminal mischief, swastika graffiti, robbery, assault, grand larceny, murder, and attempted murder. This is the job of every member of the New York City Police Department, but the focal point of our efforts in this area is the Detective Bureau's Hate Crimes Task Force. Its personnel are detectives and state troopers who are specially trained to identify and investigate hate crime. It's the largest such municipal unit in any police department in the country. Now, the NYPD, of course, saw the disturbing upward trend of violent bias crimes sweeping across the country and moved very early on. Between the time of September and December, we moved to form the Racially and Ethnically Motivated Extremism Unit, or REMI, within our Intelligence Bureau. This new unit also has about 25 NYPD personnel, detectives, analysts, police officers, working side by side with members of the New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania State Police, as well as agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. REMI is specifically dedicated to investigating not just hate crimes, but more specifically, the actions and the growth among violent hate groups as they spawn across the country and across the internet. The idea is to identify groups with a propensity to violence and those individuals who may carry it out, and to stop those incidents before they happen. To do this, we go by the same rule book and the same tactics and the same techniques we use to thwart attacks by ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the lone wolves they inspire. We've already opened dozens of investigations within REMI in the short time since it was formed. REMI consolidates and streamlines the efforts against this threat landscape and facilitates engagement within the department with our federal, state, local, and private sector partners, some of whom you spoke to today. The anti-Semitic and hateful violence we see in surrounding communities inevitably touches on New York City, even if they do not start in New York City. Because of this, wherever there's a high-profile incident anywhere in the country or in the world, such as we discussed a moment ago, the Pittsburgh synagogue attack or the Christchurch shootings on the other side of the world in New Zealand, the NYPD goes on high alert and further increases our visibility around houses of worship and customizes a deployment plan to discourage any potential copycat attacks that may be inspired. The value of our collaborative efforts to guard against violence imported into New York cannot be undersold. Remember, Jersey City is literally on our doorstep. The upstate attacker arrested by our officers in Harlem has no connections to New York City that are current, so it begs the question, why did he flee that scene and come to New York City? What was he doing there? We still don't know. That investigation continues. What his intentions were, we're still working tirelessly with our partners to find out. Most of the Proud Boys are not from New York City, but it presented too attractive a target for them when they decided to engage in violence. The white supremacist neo-Nazi group Patriot Front have taken their recruiting efforts to New York City. Just last week, they brazenly hung a banner with anti-immigrant language over an overpass in Brooklyn. The same freedom and diversity that are New York's strength are the same reason it's the #1 target for violent, foreign, and domestic extremists all at the same time. Finally, part of the New York City's holistic approach to combating hate crimes, Commissioner Shea has announced last week that hate crimes will now be included in our CompStat statistical analysis. So, as we generally follow the FBI's UCR, hate crimes will be in that lineup that we watch very closely within the numbers and the mapping and the crime strategies for any uptick or change. Anti-Semitism manifests itself in many forms: well-organized groups, to lone wolf actors, to deluded individuals, and everything in between. Anti-Semitism in all its forms, however, is steeped in ignorance and bred of muddled and incoherent conspiracy theories, some of which were discussed at this table this afternoon. It is more easily spread and consumed these days, however, because of social media. For these reasons, a lasting solution to bigotry and hatred will never be grounded solely on law enforcement and heightened security. That will only be achieved when every citizen works collectively to educate each other and reinforce our shared values of tolerance and unity. New York City and the NYPD will continue to be at the forefront of this movement. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify to this committee. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Miller, thank you. Just a quick, how much longer do we have you for? You got here to what, 10 minutes? All right, so I'm just going to take a very quick point of privilege. Remy, how many of these cases, roughly, I know you can't go into individuals, but how many are connected to neo-Nazi organizations, Atomwaffen, the base, that also have global linkages? You mentioned that you're following the same rule book that you've used over the course of the last decade, 2 decades, to attack jihadist terrorism, but you don't have the same toolkit, particularly designations of foreign terrorist organizations, which, as you know, is almost a singular focus of mine at this point. So can you give us a brief analysis, high level, of what you're seeing and how much this is hurting you, the absence of an FTO designation, as you continue to tackle neo-Nazi threats, anti-Semitic threats, and the threat of domestic terrorism?
So the Remy cases are by and large involving white supremacists and neo-Nazi groups to date. What we see is a trend that that activity is rising. What we also see, it's dynamic in that you have organized groups. Some of them, to answer the core of your questions, have overseas connections with foreign groups of the same ideology. Others are purely domestic. And then beyond that, you have people who are not part of the groups per se, but follow them online and then act out violently as lone actors. We encompass all of that, but it is disturbing when you see people who are part of supposedly domestic groups who are training overseas and domestic groups that are planning actions that, if they were doing the same action on behalf of ISIS or Al-Qaeda, would be squarely within the terrorism statutes, even though those actions are politically driven and using violence and the fear of violence are not considered terrorism under the statutes as they stand.
Do you think that we can seriously take on this fight against anti-Semitism without considering FTO designations for global neo-Nazi organizations?
I don't understand why we're torturing the subject. A terrorist should be regarded as a terrorist. I don't understand why we have to decide, well, it's terrorism, but it's domestic. But it's terrorism, but it's foreign. Terrorism is terrorism.
Okay.
And I think the statute should reflect that, to answer your question.
Not to make this overly informal, but considering that Mr. Miller is a bit constrained, does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask of Mr. Miller? Mr. King? Yeah, Ms. Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you, Commissioner Miller, for all of your hard work and dedication to the people of the United States of America and, of course, our beloved city, New York City. As you know, there have been a number of anti-Semitic incidents in my district, particularly in Midwood, in the Flatbush, and Crown Heights areas. I've urged the NYPD and other law enforcement agencies to monitor this situation closely. I'm very happy to hear what you're doing with CompStat, because I think that that may help us to get to the core of the matter. But can you discuss NYPD's strategy to combat violent hate crimes, and in particular, incidents targeted towards Jewish, particularly the Orthodox Jewish community?
So the first thing we did as these incidents began to rise, Congresswoman Clark, was to increase the police presence in those neighborhoods and around houses of worship, and in the areas where we were seeing the hate crimes. And that was a combination of precinct personnel, house of worship personnel, specially trained precinct personnel who can then literally change their uniforms and become counterterrorism officers and be placed out there because they do have that training, and that's a select group, as well as the CRC, which is the Critical Response Command. That's our forward-leaning uniformed counterterrorism force. We pushed all of that into those neighborhoods when this started, just as we pushed those forces towards mosques during the Christchurch attack, just as we pushed them towards Christian churches after the attacks in Sri Lanka. This is something that we are trying to get a handle on as to, is it a trend, is it a fad, does it have an end? But we've seen a disturbing uptick, and we're there.
In light, oh, I'm sorry. Okay, sorry, one question. Okay, sorry.
Miller, and be safe on the flight. Next, we are joined by General John R. Allen, co-chair of the Homeland Security Advisory Council Subcommittee for the Prevention of Targeted Violence Against Faith-Based Organizations. Finally, we have Mr. Paul Goldenberg, co-chair of that same advisory committee. We thank you, and we look forward to hearing your statement.
Thank you, Chairman Rose and Ranking Member Walker, members of the subcommittee, and thank you for your leadership. As noted, my name is John Allen. I'm a retired Marine, and I'm more than slightly self-conscious that I'm not from New York this afternoon. It's really a great pleasure to be before this subcommittee this afternoon, to be joined by Paul Goldenberg, who was my fellow co-chair in the Homeland Security Advisory Council Subcommittee on the prevention of targeted violence against faith-based organizations. We're exceptionally grateful for your continued leadership on this issue before us today, that of anti-Semitic violence, to include the threat of domestic terrorism, and are doubly appreciative of your support of our recently released Homeland Security Advisory Council report, which I concluded added to our submission for inclusion in the record. This is a critical moment for your leadership, and it's shining through. But more needs to be done as a collective approach to this problem. It's a broader problem than just anti-Semitism, as we found in our research, but we focus on that today, and it's absolutely crucial that we have this conversation and future conversations of this kind. Let me turn the floor at this moment, since you have given us the latitude of doing a joint statement, to Paul Goldenberg, who will speak for the next several minutes on the nature of the threat that we face. Paul?
Thank you, General. Push your button. Thank you, General. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And let me mirror General Allen's thanks to you all. We're here today because of your leadership. I also do want to add to the record that I am from the state of New Jersey. Our recent mission with the HSAC tasked us with examining, considering the rise in attacks against places of worship, the security of faith-based organizations across the country. In particular, the subcommittee we chaired was tasked to provide findings and recommendations on how DHS can best support state and local governments and faith-based organizations to keep houses of worship safe, secure, and resilient. Our final report, which was released just a month ago today, details our findings and recommendations in full. Our work was significantly aided by the advice and counsel of representing offices and entities from across all of DHS, which has a vast array of highly dedicated men and women and the broader U.S. government, including the DOJ, the FBI, and the United States Secret Service. As alluded to earlier, I believe notable is that our members took to the field. We went to the field, we went to the ground, visiting synagogues, mosques, temples, and churches, meeting with communities impacted by targeted violent attacks committed by some very heinous violent extremists. These engagements were literally eye-opening, even for a very jaded senior former police officer from the state of New Jersey. Our nation's faith-based communities are one of the few institutions that has the resources and the will to bring together people of contrasting political opinions, races, religions, and ages, uniting communities from a variety of backgrounds and interests, and offering a range of competencies not often found in a single community or organization, or for that matter, police force or government agency. They have the fundamentals to empower people, developing a sense of ownership among all members of the community. And for some, they see it as an Achilles heel. Unfortunately, the question of whether faith-based communities, and certainly the Jewish community, is targeted by hatred and terror is not up for debate. Synagogues here and abroad remain targets. To the threat itself, the primary inspiration behind many of these targeted violent attacks is to force us to not merely question our fundamental safety and security, as well our ability to protect our nation, neighborhoods, families, and to look to change our behaviors. Success in the eyes of these domestic terrorists comes when we retract from our daily routines, ways of living, and even spiritual and political beliefs. We need to further explore the impact of these hate-filled messages with public trust, as well as attacks perpetrated from white violent supremacist actors and other similar separatist and violent extremist groups grow in number. We should all be concerned that an adverse public reaction may generate something that these violent extremists could never have achieved on their own. This complex psychological progression becomes an enabling tool for those who seek to derail our way of life. Indeed, citizens immunized against the psychological influence of targeted violence and terrorism have a much greater ability to resist such manipulation. That is our perspective, and that was our mission within the HSAC, and I'd like to now turn it over to General Allen to discuss the recommendations for how we respond to these threats. General?
So, ladies and gentlemen of the subcommittee, and thank you, Paul, what he's described is no ordinary threat. It's a national security issue for the United States, and it's a threat to our way of life. That's the truth, plain and simple, and I think the testimony of the first panel, that of Mr. Miller, that of what we discovered in the course of our research for this report, it substantiates the nature of this threat. Nevertheless, we're not here today to admire the problem, we're here to discuss what we can do about it. And to that end, much of this is reflected almost verbatim from our recent report. We need to be thinking about these issues at a strategic level and have a tactical framing as well. Or rather, there are efforts that can be undertaken at the national level with the Congress and the administration leading the charge, but there are also many efforts that can be undertaken at the local level also. Now, our report contains 46 recommendations overall, and we lay out 7 key recommendations in the executive summary in response to the unique nature of the issue. We're happy to go into greater detail during the Q&A. Now, to add a bit of personal framing from my own experience in counterterrorism, we looked at how communities can prepare themselves prior to the terrorist incident or the attack, what we call to the left of the incident. We looked at how communities can prepare and react to the incident itself during its course, what we sometimes call at the bang. And we also talked about and researched what can be done on the other side of the incident, the right of the incident, where resilience and reconciliation and recovery is essential. And we looked at those measures across all of those. And at the incident itself, at the point to the left of the incident, before it occurs, many preventive measures are available to these communities. And here, consistent training and community outreach, which we've discussed already in the first panel, especially between state and local law enforcement officials and first responders, is essential with our faith-based communities. At the incident itself, at the attack, there are protective measures which can range from deployment of protective security advisors to increased coordination with responders, and of course, increased defensive capabilities, hardening the infrastructure within the communities themselves. And in this category, funding, especially through the FEMA Nonprofit Security Grant Program, is crucial. And I have to commend this committee and the Congress for not just enlarging that funding, but being open to a discussion to increase it even more. And finally, to the right of the incident, after it has occurred, this can include anything from resiliency efforts with the community to efforts focused on healing and reconciliation, as well as justice and accountability. It's the response with social workers and community advocates and law enforcement and healers playing such an important role alongside our police and first responders, as well as civil leadership and legislators. It's that response that can carry the community through the trauma of that attack and to some form of normalcy in the aftermath. Very importantly, I said legislators, because I believe that for the Congress it means three things. And this is a personal plea as much as it is a recommendation from the co-chairs of the subcommittee. First, I believe that no other body today in the United States can maintain focus on this threat and protection of our faith communities as can the U.S. Congress. You are of the people, you represent the people, and your attention on this matter, as evidenced by today, is extraordinary, and your attention continuing into the future will be absolutely essential. Second, you have the power of the purse, and there is a need for increased funding, not just in the form of grants, but increased assistance to law enforcement at all levels. And third, our laws. We've talked a lot this afternoon about proposed legislation and legislation that is in the process of being enacted. I could not more strongly associate myself with all of that conversation, because we have to have the laws to hold those accountable when they perpetrate these kinds of crimes. But there needs to be a formal discussion, a full discussion on the nature of a domestic terror law. I believe we've reached that point in this emergency, where we not only talk about a domestic terror law, but we also talk about designating domestic terror organizations and domestic terrorists themselves. It's an unsettled conversation. We've not found our way to a final conclusion. And there are complexities about this associated with the First Amendment and constitutional rights and civil rights, which are fraught. But we have to have this conversation now, given the uptick in the violence against the Jewish community, but the other communities, communities of color, the Muslim communities, the Sikh and the Hindu communities, our black communities in the context of the Christian church. We have to have these conversations. And I believe it's the time now to have that conversation about whether we have a domestic terror law and domestic terror designations. And with that, I'll turn it back to Paul for his closing remarks.
Thank you, General. As the list of recent attacks against American faith-based communities grows almost daily, we have seen a rekindled call for domestic terrorism laws, as the General just referred to provide federal law enforcement agencies similar tools that are available to combat targeted violent attacks by international terrorists. And I think we heard that several times today from the law enforcement experts. It's been resonating. Many believe that these bills specifically would provide required resources to federal law enforcement officials, some of which have indicated they do not possess the suitable tools
Mr.
for
Goldberg,
addressing.
my apologies. We've stretched this. We have to vote right now. So what we're going to do is the committee is going to stand in recess to allow members to vote on the floor. Then the committee will reconvene 10 minutes thereafter, and we'll continue this very, very important conversation. Thank you. Okay. My sincerest apologies again. We will get started. To General Allen, when I was speaking with him a few hours ago when he introduced himself to me and I to him, he said, I believe that we served together at one point, which is officially going down as the greatest understatement in the history of my life. But thank you again, and we'll let your testimony continue.
Okay. Thank you, Congressman. In closing, as the list of recent attacks against American faith-based communities grows, we've seen a rekindled call for domestic terrorism laws to provide federal law enforcement agencies similar tools that are available to combat targeted violence attacks committed by international terrorists. Many believe that these bills specifically would provide required resources to federal law enforcement officials, some of which have indicated they currently do not possess the suitable tools for addressing domestic terrorism. And we're happy to talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A. But to close, faith-based, non-governmental organizations, as we all know, extend far beyond faith, spiritual care, health, and human services. They're an important component of a collective and cooperative Homeland Security effort. Faith-based and non-governmental organizations own and operate infrastructure that remains vulnerable to attack, provides direct support and response to our nation's worst natural and man-made disasters, and provides vital resources and services to tens of millions of Americans every day. By educating lay leaders, community members, sharing critical real-time information, and by more effectively working with our law enforcement partners, they will have the fundamentals to empower themselves, developing a sense of ownership among the whole community. Every recommendation that General Allen discussed today, to include what is encompassed in our HSAC report, is sourced in that reality and that framing. Finally, let me say that having had the honor and privilege of working with our current Acting Secretary, Chad Wolf, over the years, I could not possibly recount the number of times that he has pushed on these issues, and with me personally as well. General Allen noted in his statement that the importance of being seized at this moment and this topic is more significant and critical than ever. That is certainly the case for Acting Secretary Wolf, and I can personally attest to his passion and care in fighting for progress and support of our faith-based communities. With that, we'll close. General Allen and I welcome your comments and questions, and thank you for the opportunity to speak on this most important and critical issue.
Thank you again for your testimony. I'll now yield to one of the fiercest fighters against anti-Semitism in the country, Congressman Josh Gottheimer of New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, thank you for being here. Mr. Miller, thank you for being here. I'm honored to have you both in our presence. General, do you think it would be helpful if we had a domestic terror law? I have a piece of legislation that I'm working on that I had introduced in a bipartisan way last Congress, which freezes the assets of domestic terrorists, called the FASTER Act. Do you think that would be helpful in our fight against ISIS-inspired homegrown terrorists and other homegrown terrorists in the United States?
Yes. I don't think there's any question. And that's my opinion. It was not an opinion that we expressed in the report. In the report, we made the point that this is an issue that needs to be thoroughly debated. Because on the one side, it gives us the tools that you've discussed, Congressman. On the other side, there are concerns about civil rights, and that conversation needs to be had because it's not settled. I happen to believe that we should be both we should have both a domestic terror law and we should have the capacity to do designations of domestic terrorists as well.
Thank you, General. In what cases do you think it would be best utilized? And obviously, in your important work that you're doing right now and Homeland to fight anti-Semitism, how do you believe it would actually could be utilized to help protect our country?
Well, obviously, those individuals who are organized in a manner that will employ violence as an extension of their extreme ideology, there should be a price to be paid for that. There should also be a price to be paid for those in the same context as foreign terrorist organization designations, for those that provide material support to those kinds of organizations as well. As a commander overseas, fighting both the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, one of the great assets that I had was the foreign terrorist organization designation. This terrorist threat is no less a threat now in the United States as Americans descend upon Americans and inflict terror in enormous quantities upon various communities. Having that legal mechanism, both in terms of freezing assets, limiting travel, penalizing those who provide material support to this kind of a group, as well as designating individuals, I think that gives us another tool in the toolbox to deal with these people.
Excellent, thank you, General. And either one of you might take this one, and this builds on the FTO designation, General. You know, and one thing that Chairman Rose and I have worked on together with others in a bipartisan way is fighting the massive spread of terror online, which through social media has been now used as a tool to recruit, as you know, not just around the world, but at home. And one thing we've been concerned about is the spread on, and listen, Facebook has taken a lot of steps, and we worked pretty closely to try to encourage Twitter to do the same, but these handles go up every single day. It's hard to stay ahead of them, and we know it's being used as a tool in their arsenal, the terrorists against us. And those who have foreign terrorist organization designations should not be allowed, in our opinion, in my opinion, to be able to post online, to have handles, to be on Facebook, to be on YouTube. So either one of you, if in general, maybe you start, and your thoughts on that.
Well, you know, the entire cyber domain in which so much of the world operates now, and you have the cyber domain and the physical domain. We're in the physical domain at the moment. But the cyber domain, just as I mentioned that there is the capacity under the foreign terrorist organization designation to limit the movement of terrorists in the physical domain by limiting their capacity to travel, having the capacity to limit the movement of domestic terrorists in the cyber domain by limiting their access by law to certain social platforms is a different way of thinking about this. Right. And I think we need to think in those terms. In the cyber domain, there are no boundaries. There are no borders. Sovereignty has an entirely different meaning than it has had traditionally. And when domestic terrorists victimize elements of our population and move with impunity from one platform to another, we should be thinking in those terms. This is a different kind of sovereignty. This is a digital sovereignty. And we should be confining and limiting their capacity to move across the cyber domain and use that domain as the mechanism and the platform to victimize our population.
Excellent, I really appreciate it. Mr. Miller, I'm sorry, I know I'm more limited on the clock here.
Take your time.
Thank you. Mr. Miller?
Goldenberg, Paul.
I'm sorry, Paul. Sorry about that.
From New Jersey, by the way. From New Jersey.
Where in Jersey are you from?
Well, grew up Essex County, but now down in Monmouth County.
Really? Yeah. Nice by the shore, huh? Excellent, terrific.
Not feeling self-confident again.
I love it. I love a Jersey guy.
Let me share, if I
Thank
can,
you.
and I'll do it very quickly, a very quick story.
Sorry, Mr. Goldberg.
How many of you have heard of Whitefish, Montana? All right, hopefully you'll Google it when we're done. Whitefish, Montana is a pristine, beautiful place. It's actually pretty magical. Sits on the side of a mountain amongst some very good people. Whitefish, Montana is a population of 8,126 Jews. 2 Hanukkahs ago, I received a phone call from a Rabbi Roston. Rabbi Roston said to me, "What do we do here?" My son's photo, the photo of Tanya Gersh, who is a local realtor in town, who got into there was a situation between herself and Richard Spencer's mother, and Richard Spencer, I'm referring to at that time, was an individual that was very, very proactive in certain ideologies. There are folks that placed the families, the sons, the 12 and 13-year-old children on the internet, and they put a swastika, a Star of David with Yud across the chest of the children, and trolled these children and calling for an armed insurrection against the Jews of Whitefish. It was literally one of the most heinous acts that I've seen. As a former law enforcement executive myself, I know that, and I've used the word jaded, that if someone took one of my children's photos or their photos of one of my grandchildren, that would have a huge impact and would put terror and fear into my heart. Here's the problem. No one was arrested, no one was prosecuted, and quite frankly, this isn't a criticism, but the local attorney general's office, prosecutor's office, the state attorney general's offices, the state investigative bureaus, they weren't quite sure how to handle such a thing. But here we had a Jewish community literally rethinking whether they stay put in a beautiful, pristine place such as Whitefish. And now, 2.5, almost 3 years later, they're there, they're stronger than ever. They received tremendous support from the local citizenry of all colors and religions. But the fact of the matter is that it was not a clear margin. And that's something that I think we have to have a real tough talk, not only with those that are propagating these types of threats, terrorist threats, but that's a conversation probably for DOJ and Bureau and other federal agencies to sit down and explore and determine what do we do and where is the line drawn on events or incidents such as that.
Thank you, Mr. Schollenberg. I really appreciate it. Thank you both for your time today. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Congressman Ted Deutsch from the fantastic great state of Florida.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for allowing me to join your panel. And General and Mr. Goldenberg, I'm most grateful for your efforts here, for choosing to focus on these issues. I just wanted to follow up on just a couple of things that you were both speaking about. General Allen, when you talk about cyber, we have conversations regularly about social media companies and the responsibility for social media that social media companies should have. You touched on that a bit. I wanted to actually talk about what we don't often talk about, which is those who use those companies to draw people into the dark web, and the kinds of things that happen there and the violence that's promoted there. And I just wonder if you have, if either of you have thoughts on how to actually combat those kinds of efforts. And I'll ask that question, and Mr. Goldberg, I'll follow up with you.
And the good news, the bad news is we've come so far out of the dark web. We're not even in the dark web. When I say it's out of the dark web. The domains that are being used now, it's across the spectrum. It's 4chan, 8chan, Reddit. I mean, I could rattle off. I know that the head of the ADL today did a very eloquent job describing some of the concerns and the threats that are coming from these very dark places. The problem is, and the general knows this better than anyone, when he saw how a very, I don't want to say unsophisticated group, but a group that came together and became very sophisticated very quick. And people literally woke up one day and said, how did ISIS get here? And I say that humbly because the person that was responsible for the fight is sitting to my right. But it didn't just get here. And the level of threat, the level of concern that we should have as a nation, the concern is what we're not seeing. It's what we're not seeing. I have a young 26-year-old research person that continuously reminds me of what I'm missing out there. And when you ask for a show of hands within various law enforcement communities and say, how many of us know what 4chan is or 8chan? It's unfortunate that we do need to know about these things because people are putting their manifestos out there, they're laying out their plans out there, and at minimum, and I'm not talking about First Amendment, I'm talking about when people are planning and plotting to kill or maim or destroy because of color of skin or religion, et cetera. So we do need to be deeply concerned.
And then finally, Mr. Chairman, if I might, when you recount the story from Montana, from Whitefish, the community never could have imagined what happened to them. The community in Squirrel Hill never could have imagined what would befall them and the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in America's history. The Chabad in Poway never could have imagined, and certainly no one in New York could have imagined, certainly could never have imagined a machete-wielding attacker walking in during a Hanukkah celebration. But people also couldn't have imagined that Jews would be attacked as Jews, because they're Jews, on the streets, in some cases every day. And if you could, I guess as we round this out, if you could just speak to the terror that, and I ask both you and General Allen, given your experience, the terror that creates in that community, in this case, the Jewish community, but ultimately why it is that the broader community, that America as a whole ought to be genuinely worried about that.
I think we have to do a better job, obviously, at the level of the education of our children, about how intolerant we should be of hatred, and how we should create an environment of education that prizes and celebrates the diversity of our community, and how civility has to shoot through all that we do. It has to be at the strategic level something about the shaping of the education of our children. It has to be about what kinds of behaviors we will tolerate. And absent the kinds of strategic measures that can be taken, or the policies that can be enacted, or the legislation that can be passed, we leave large gaps in the field to be filled by those dark forces that will find themselves able to operate with impunity. In the battlefield of Iraq, those areas that we didn't control, we called them the coldest space in the room, and that was where the enemy would accumulate. Those areas that are not regulated, those areas that don't have policy that attach themselves to it, those areas that don't benefit from education, it creates cold spots within which those kinds of communities can accumulate. And let me go back to the cyber piece a minute, because this has really given the capacity for isolated individuals and isolated groups to be joined together in a common cause of hatred in ways that we've never seen before. It has both increased the surface area of these groups, it has increased the magnitude of the hate within the groups, and it has accelerated the capacity of these groups to take action. And often in the world that I live in now, often we talk about artificial intelligence and emerging technologies constantly. And one of the challenges we have, and this is the unique role of the Congress, sir, and you have been deeply involved in this, and we're all grateful for your leadership. But the reality is that technology is moving so fast that policy and legislation is always in trail, and sometimes it's years behind. And I just tried to describe a few minutes ago that the cyber environment in which this hate occurs and within which the connectivity can be affected, and by which the actions can then come back out in the physical community in school shootings or in attacks on Jewish communities, that's the physical manifestation of the things that are occurring in the cyber domain. Yet this is so new to us as a people that we have yet to understand that the technology is moving so quickly that the kinds of legislation and policy necessary to regulate that is far behind. And so we scratch our heads when we wonder why the social media platforms aren't taking the steps necessary. They're all technicians. So it requires that the American people, through their elected representatives, understand that unless we can generate the kinds of controls and legislation and policy necessary to gain control of the cyber domain, just as we have them for the physical domain, we will still be scratching our heads because we are watching actions and behaviors and levels of hatred unfolding in the cyber domain that we could never have imagined in the physical domain because they were isolated from each other. Now they're joined together. And they're not just joined together in the United States, they're joined together with groups overseas. And added to that, not just the white supremacist organizations in the United States joining with those overseas, The strategic influence campaign of the Russians is aiding this as well. So it's not just group to group. It's the explicit state policy of the Russian government to interfere in the democracy and in the civil society of the United States. And these actions together constitute a direct threat to the national security of the United States. But much of it is occurring in the cyber domain right up to the point where it becomes a physical threat. And then we're behind the power curve. And a final point, sorry. Just as technology has given the capacity for these groups to mass and attack, there are technologies out there today, some young groups, small startups, with exquisite algorithms, with the capacity to find these organizations in cyberspace because of the memes that they use, because of the code words that they employ. They leave a cyber trail. And the capacity, and this is what's very, very important, and we had this conversation with the secretary, the acting secretary on Monday, an extended conversation. He has taken our report and handed it to his department and given them 2 weeks to come back for an implementation plan for the recommendations. That's extraordinary leadership from my perspective. They're going to get after this. Part of it has got to be that we must aggressively leverage the advances in technology right now that the enemy is using, and the enemy is walking amongst us, that the enemy is using to victimize and attack and kill our faith-based organizations, our faith-based communities, but more broadly, the American public.
May I just and I know we're, here's...
Take as much time as you need.
I've just spent the last, almost the last decade, but the last 3 years through Rutgers University, we're working transnationally in out of Jewish communities across all of Europe. And I don't know how many of you have traveled to Europe as of late, but in many cases in Germany and in Netherlands and in France and in Sweden and in other parts, you cannot go into a synagogue without crack military troops with long rifles and sandbags in some cases, greeting you in barbed wire, greeting you at the entranceway. And these are democratic, wonderful institutions, many of which had survived World War II. That is a canary in a mine, and probably very much a place that we never want to get to here in the United States. So these types of works, these collaborative works between DHS and other federal agencies and the communities is probably more critical and important today than ever. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time has long past expired, but I want to thank the witnesses and at a moment when the community, when the Jewish community, large Jewish community I represent, Jewish community all throughout America, feels under threat. It is real leadership that you have shown in calling this hearing with these witnesses to help elevate this issue to the level that it deserves, and I am most grateful to you.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for everything that you have done for so many years on this issue. Two pieces of legislation I'd like to bring to your attention that we're working on, or two projects. One is designating global neo-Nazi organizations as FTOs, particularly Azov Battalion, Nordic Resistance, National Action, and Sonnenkrieg. The second is the Raise the Bar Act, which should be an innovative partnership between the Department of Homeland Security as well as a university and trusted flaggers to, on a quarterly basis, measure how well social media companies fulfill their own codes of conduct as it relates to getting terrorist content off of their platforms. These are two pieces of legislation that we would like to actively work with you on. And I believe, based off your testimony, it seems as if they are much needed. Would you agree?
Absolutely agree.
Scholar?
100%. Again, as someone who's working abroad right now and watching these movements grow, watching these populist movements go from the margins to now as acceptable movements within some of these countries. They are communicating here. They are working with some of our are players here, are actors. So I think there's more of a need now than ever.
And I want to speak more to the global nature of this and start to disabuse ourselves of the notion that there's something happening in Europe or throughout the rest of the world, and it is entirely separate from what is happening here. General, you led the fight against ISIL. Do you see any commonalities between the global jihadist movement and the global neo-Nazi movement?
I do. I'm not an expert on the subject. I know the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda pretty well, but the behaviors that I have seen lead me to believe that there is a connectivity that we should be certain of. This would be an area where I would want to focus serious intelligence resources to establish unambiguously, and unambiguously is the term I'll use, the connectivity between the two. You know, I've said here now several times during my testimony that the environment in which we live today, where so much of our moment-to-moment existence is defined by a cyber environment, where I have the capacity to, on an encrypted application, have near real-time, actually real-time, video, telephone, and SMS communications with someone anywhere in the world. The problem we had with the Islamic State was, because of these applications and the internet and encrypted applications, they could plan strategically in a distributed manner, separated by continents. They could move regionally by using criminal networks, and they could attack locally, and it could be all, as Director Comey used to call it, all in the dark. Very difficult to perceive. And that kind of connectivity knows no boundaries. It doesn't know mountains, it doesn't know oceans. That kind of connectivity is real-time, it's instant, at the speed of light, and organizations that wish us ill harm, organizations that would attack the Jewish community of the United States, that are already attacking the Jewish community in Europe, find allies in the United States over the cyber environment, and we've left that line of communication open for them. So when we think about first designating them as a neo-Nazi organization, as a foreign terrorist organization, I don't know what the argument is. I need to have someone tell me why we wouldn't. Because in the end, if that organization wishes American interests and American citizens and our allies ill, which is a big part of why we designate someone as a foreign terrorist organization, this seems to me doesn't require a lot of debate.
What you mentioned earlier that you could not have conducted the fight against ISIL without the FTO designation, authority or power, or without these organizations labeled as such. Can you expand on that?
Let me say that it was quite helpful. I mean, I was doing lots of fighting against ISIS that didn't require FTOs, but what FTOs would do was, if they are non-American citizens, and most of them are aliens, they can't travel freely. And when we work through the Department of Justice, when we've designated an organization, we work with the Department of Justice, when elements, and I'll particularly talk about the Haqqani network, which was in eastern, the federally administered tribal areas, from your own experience. You remember what the Haqqanis did coming out of the highland. FTO designations for us gave us the capacity to limit their capacity to travel. It froze their resources, and it also gave us the ability to sanction those who provided material support to them. That's a very valuable asset. And just being on the list of being on an American list, maintained through the State Department, of being a foreign terrorist organization, creates for us a connectivity with our allies that is very valuable to us as well in dealing with this at a global level.
Something that I urge you to consider in future reports is that over 17,000, nearly 20,000 foreign fighters have gone to fight with the Azov Battalion from 50 different countries. That is more than the number of foreign fighters that went to go fight with the Mujahideen at the height of the Soviet Union's war in Afghanistan. I cannot say with certainty, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that we have a system in place right now to track every American who is going to fight with the Azov Battalion. Is that correct?
That's not something I can comment on with any knowledge.
Can I have your commitment that in your current capacity, advising the Homeland Security Department, that this is something that you will consider going further?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, first of all, for your extraordinary service. It goes without saying that considering both of your extraordinary experience, you do not have to be doing this right now. And it exemplifies both your patriotism, your commitment to this country, and for that we are in deep, deep gratitude. And thank you for taking the time today.
Chairman, thank you for your leadership. Thank you for convening this hearing and for the additional work you plan to do on this. This is a direct threat to the American people, and thank you for your leadership in dealing with it.
Thank you very much.